Do you have my keys?
Good morning, Colorado. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It is Thursday, November 12th, 9:01, and we are going live with our penultimate rulemaking on mission change, the 1200 series. To get this going, we will initiate a roll call with Hearings Manager Larson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Gibbs.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez. Commissioner Gonzalez. You may still be muted, Commissioner Gonzalez.
1 second.
I think Bill might be frozen.
Frozen. We'll go down the line and come back to Commissioner Gonzalez. Commissioner McGowan. Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Putnam. Excuse me. Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
We'll go back to Commissioner Gonzalez. Commissioner Gonzalez?
I think he's logging out and logging back in, so let's give him a second.
Give him a second. And I know that Mr. Hackett will be here on behalf of Commissioner Putnam, so we will bring him in.
Excellent. Yeah, so let's give Commissioner Gonzalez a second, and we see Mr. Hackett has Q&A'd you. Looks like we've got him on board.
Commissioner Hackett.
Good morning,
Here.
Commissioner Hackett.
Good morning.
Good to see you. Thanks for being with us. As we're waiting on Commissioner Gonzalez to be able to log back in via Zoom, I'll sort of set the stage with regard to the day before us. We will start with a director staff summary of the final proposed 1200 series rules. That'll take up most of the morning. We'll have Q&A with commissioners to the director and staff. We will have members of COGCC staff present, and I believe we'll have members of Colorado Parks and Wildlife available to present and or answer questions. We'll then start this afternoon with the party presentations, and we have about 8 or 9 different parties that have been grouped together that will present. That'll get us through the afternoon, and then tomorrow we will start up again with party presentations pretty much throughout the day. And then if we hold to our calendar, we would start Monday the 16th with closing statements and commissioner deliberation. And then just to remind everybody, we did continue the 200 through 600 final vote until November 20th. So we're looking for a final vote on all of the efforts that have been undertaken for the last year and a half, Friday, November 20th, on all of the rule series. So with that, looks like we're still not having Commissioner Gonzalez with us. So let's just pause for a moment and see if we can get him on board.
It isn't Commissioner Gonzalez, but it'll work for a few minutes.
Hello there, Walter.
Can you say hi? Can you say hi? Can you say dragon?
How about dump truck?
Say dump truck?
Don't drop.
I'm guessing, like many others, our childcare situation is compromised with a very close COVID encounter. We're all well, but I'm sure so many other people on the call are dealing with the same situation. Hugs mostly. Chair, do you want me to give Commissioner Gonzalez a quick call?
I'm texting with him. He's, last text was technical difficulties standing by. I said, we're waiting. What we may do is give him another minute or two, and then we could get started, and then he could catch back up by reviewing the record.
Yep.
Director Murphy, why don't we go ahead and get started? We'll note for the record that it's 9:09, and Commissioner Gonzalez will be able to catch up over the lunch break and whatever he may have missed with regard to the staff report.
Can you give me 2 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everybody, you got 2 minutes to freshen up your coffee.
All right, Chair. I think if folks are ready, I can jump in at this point.
Very good.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for a few more minutes. Hopefully Walter's cameos will be fairly limited over the next hour or so. Today, staff of both COGCC and CPW are coming together to present to you the wildlife rules, mostly within COGCC's proposed 1200 series. I would like to express kind of an unexpressible level of gratitude to CPW for the time that they have put in and invested in us and in this process. Brett Ackerman, who you hear from later, has led just an incredible team of experts who've been thoughtful, methodical, and really worked through a number of issues. In addition, on our side, Greg has been tireless. I don't know how, sorry, Mr. Duranlo, I don't know how Greg has gotten through all of these different rule series with so much focus on his team and the work that they provide, but I'm certainly grateful for it. Bye-bye, Walter. Sorry. Lastly, I can't express enough gratitude for the passionate scientists, citizens, and oil and gas operators who've engaged in this process. It's been quite a work. So jumping into more of the substance, I wanted to provide a quick overview. And what I will say is that I think that staff's presentation, staff and CPW's joint presentation, will probably run an hour and a half or so. I think that the pieces really hang together. So if you can hold on to your questions, I think it'll help make more sense. We might have the opportunity to answer questions that come up. So that being said, if it's a burning question and you just can't bear to wait, that's fine. We'll take it. So in terms of the overview itself, I know that there have been a number of concerns about the scope of the wildlife rulemaking, but I feel that both the breadth and the scope are appropriate given the directives of 181, the sweeping changes to the permitting process that the Commission has preliminarily approved, and the fact that we are long overdue for a rulemaking to update CRGCC's wildlife rules and maps. Taking first 181, the 1200 series rulemaking, or the wildlife rulemaking, incorporates the mitigation hierarchy for minimizing impacts by avoiding impacts first, then minimizing and mitigating those impacts that cannot be avoided. Critical to this avoidance piece is the no surface occupancy provisions in Rule 1202C, as well as the alternative location analysis requirements that are in the 300 series and will be discussed later today. Also, the proposed rules enhance protections for wildlife consistent with the framework shift created by 181. We are specifically implementing the directive to address compensatory mitigation in proposed Rule 1203. In concert with the changes to the 300 series and Rule 904, these rules will assist the Commission with both evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts to wildlife resources. And then separate from what 181 has directed as it relates to wildlife, in my opinion, the scope of the rulemaking is further necessary for two reasons. First, the changes are necessary to complement what we've done to revise the permitting process. And second, the last mapping update for wildlife for CRGCC was conducted in 2013 and has not been updated since. So it is important that we come before you today to reevaluate the habitat and adopt rules that reflect current CPW wildlife management recommendations, in my estimation. So again, today we come to you today to implement these needed changes in concert with the changes required by 181. Sorry, I'm actually manipulating my own slides today, which is pretty dangerous. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking through some key topics. I've touched on some of these points earlier, but want to dive into a little bit more detail. The idea of the hierarchy that I think that 181 created is this avoid, minimize, mitigate. And our rules begin with a premise of avoiding impacts as necessary because it's the best way to protect. And then they cascade through the concepts of minimizing and mitigating. Avoidance is driven on the front end planning through the alternative location analysis and substantively through the NSO provisions, or no surface occupancy provisions, of Rule 1202C. So many of the rule changes proposed in 200 through 600 were also focused on planning first, especially at a landscape level. And the changes proposed for the wildlife resources protection have received the same focus from our staff, in that we want to encourage planning first. I think if we can look at a landscape level plan, we can think about individual pads and locations differently or more collectively. In addition, kind of transitioning away from avoidance and into minimizing impacts, the other provisions in 1202 address minimization through operating practices, and then can be complemented by permit-specific best management practices. And lastly, for those impacts that cannot be avoided or minimized, Rule 1203 specifies rules to develop permit-specific conditions for mitigation. So again, I wanted to walk through how we think the proposed 1200 series implements the 181 hierarchy, avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating. Turning now to one of the second really big picture topics that has a number of intensely discussed subparts is the high priority habitat. Foundationally, the concept of high priority habitat replaces existing sensitive wildlife habitat and restricted surface area occupancy provisions under existing rules. Staff chose this approach to simplify the nomenclature and mapping to be consistent with how CPW categorizes, labels, and maps those species and habitats that require certain management strategies to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts that occur during any development proposed across the state, including oil and gas development. Turning now to the mapping of high priority habitat, in response to calls by parties and stakeholders for a clear, transparent CRGCC process to define the extent of high priority habitat, staff proposes that the Commission adopt the high priority habitat maps as rules and commit to updating those maps every year. If every year is infeasible, we think at most it should be every 2 years. This ensures that COGCC's regulatory provisions will reflect the best available data and management recommendations for wildlife resources. We do recognize, however, that within even a year, the wildlife or habitat may change, as these are dynamic elements and the map will necessarily be static. So staff has proposed 2 provisions in Rule 309E that provide for site-specific considerations. First, if species or habitat are present but not mapped that require protection, CPW may request a consultation, i.e. this is kind of an on-ramp. Complementary to this, or kind of the flip side of the same coin, if mapped species and habitat are not present, CPW can waive consultation, i.e. this is an off-ramp. Thus, within the concept of high priority habitat, whether it's a 1202C or other, there are processes that allow for site-specific considerations. Within high priority habitat, the aquatic habitats have also received plenty of attention from stakeholders and are also the foundation of staff's proposed riparian setback. I will discuss this in much more detail shortly. Lastly, the critical issue around 1202C and the role and scope and applicability of it. I would offer a couple of thoughts on this provision. First, Senate Bill 181 directed COGCC to implement a mitigation hierarchy that starts with avoidance of impacts, then minimizes, and then mitigate. And CPW, based on its deep wildlife expertise, has recommended that certain habitats that must be avoided because impacts to these habitats are difficult or impossible to minimize or mitigate. The habitats included within 1202C reflect a narrow band within the broader scope of mapped high priority habitat, which reflects the precision of the proposed rules. Turning now to process, many stakeholders have raised concerns about 1202C. 3 of those issues generally are: 1, the scope or breadth or inclusion of habitat in 1202C, 2, how the consultation will work, and 3, whether the rule itself should include an exception process. On the first issue, while I studied wildlife biology many years ago, it's best for me to leave it to our experts at CPW to address what species are on the 1202C list and answer questions about that given their scope and expertise. On the second issue, I want to be clear that consultation occurs on 1202C habitats. This is critical to ensure that the site-specific provisions of 309 that I discussed earlier can be integrated into the conversation. On the third issue, staff firmly believes that the current framework implements a directive to avoid impacts and that creating a categorical exception to the process within 1202C is not consistent with the mitigation hierarchy, CPW's recommendations, or the dual missions of CPW and COGCC. In fact, the variance process exists in the 500 series for the Commission to consider in appropriate circumstances deviating from the 1202C no surface occupancy requirements. In addition, the proposed rules include flexibility in 3 ways: site-specific determination. There are targeted exclusions for maintenance activities or access or utility corridors. And finally, as I'll discuss next, there is a limited exception process for intermittent and ephemeral streams. I know you will hear significant concerns about the scope and applicability of 1202C, but I believe the draft as proposed implements 181 and its direction to protect wildlife resources appropriately. Turning now to another high big picture issue of biological resources. Many stakeholders have called upon COGCC to reformulate its rules to define and specifically protect biological resources. Staff's draft rules propose the same framework for protecting biological resources as exists in current rules, which is that the breadth of the rules considered in total achieve the statutory directive to protect against any adverse environmental impacts on biological resources. As detailed in Attachment 5 to the Statement of Basis and Purpose, and briefly summarized on this slide, proposed rules exist to protect water, topsoil, wildlife, habitat, and ecosystems, to minimize surface disturbance, to remove noxious plants, and to require reclamation, including topsoil replacement, use of appropriate seed mixes, and achieve revegetation requirements. Staff believes that taken as a whole, the rules as proposed provide protections to biological resources consistent with what the Act requires. Similarly, through the mission change rulemaking, the Commission has maintained and strengthened many of the rules related to these topics, which necessarily will enhance protections for biological resources. In addition, inclusion of biological resources in the 1200 series is inappropriate in my estimation because the 1200 series implements the statutory directive for COGCC to consult with CPW on wildlife resources. And through that process, we would integrate CPW's wildlife-related expertise, which, while incredibly deep, does not broadly include all aspects of biological resources, particularly invertebrates and plants. Importantly, 181 did not create a specific or separate mandate for the Commission to protect biological resources in my reading, nor did it otherwise substantially change the manner in which the Commission should protect biological resources within the broader scheme of the Commission's regulations. The legislation carried forward the existing consideration of biological resources into the framework recast by 181. Thus, the existing umbrella approach to protecting biological resources is consistent with 181's changes to the Act. That said, there are sources of information available that could in the future be helpful in COGCC's review of oil and gas. On that front, COGCC does support working with CPW and other DNR divisions to evaluate and consider the applicability of data gathered by the Colorado Natural Heritage Program through its Codex initiative. I believe we heard about that some on Tuesday from Mr. Anderson with CNHP. This initiative remains currently under development. However, building that into a rule provision is premature at this point. Today, I believe we should focus on how Attachment 5 interrelates with Codex and COGCC's new processes and look to the future. But at this point, I think it's premature to broadly integrate that into COGCC's processes. Another important component is that as we focus so wholly today on the wildlife resources and protecting them, we need to remember how the 1200 series nests within the remaining or within other important rule provisions, and specifically those related to permitting. We've done a lot of work on these other rule series that also benefits wildlife resources, and we need to be mindful of that. Specifically within the 300 series, I want to remind everybody about the consultation process because it exists and received a significant amount of work to integrate coordination with both local governments and the federal government. We refined that consultation process in August, and it provides a great deal of opportunity to integrate the expertise brought by our federal partners and local governments into all of the conversations around a proposed oil and gas location, including those related to wildlife. Again, the focus in the 1200 series on advanced planning is consistent with what we proposed and hope the Commission ultimately adopts next week for the OGDP and cap requirements in the 300 series. I also want to remind us all that in the 400 series and 600 series, we have specific rules for noise, light, dust, water quality, and consolidating surface disturbance. Similarly, a number of the provisions from the 900 series, which I didn't capture on this slide, also provide wildlife benefits. Last, as we think about cumulative impacts, we did include specific provisions to integrate a consideration of wildlife habitat into the CIDR database, and also specific reporting out provisions in proposed Rule 904 to be able to report back to the Commission about wildlife specific issues. Turning now to one of the most, I would say, engaging issues perhaps, is riparian setbacks. This slide summarizes the context for staff's proposed riparian setback, which builds upon the aquatic habitat protections proposed in the Notice 1200 series rule this summer. Staff had initially proposed a 300-foot no surface occupancy or setback for 3 aquatic habitats, as well as a 300-foot setback for new staging, refueling, or chemical storage areas. During the 2 through 600 rulemaking, I heard the Commission request that staff propose a riparian setback. And in evaluating this request, we reviewed what staff proposed in June for the 1200 series wildlife resources, the relevant literature, party filings, as well as the breadth of the proposed rules outside of 1200 that function to protect water against impacts from oil and gas development. I will discuss those provisions shortly. After reviewing all this, staff proposed regulatory requirements for a riparian setback on October 9th. The proposal consisted of 3 components: expanding from 300 feet to 500 feet for the no surface occupancy, and the setback for staging, refueling, and chemical storage areas. It also included excluding from the NSO access roads and pipeline or utility corridors for the 3 aquatic habitats. It also created a waiver process by which the director and CPW can waive the no surface occupancy for intermittent and ephemeral streams within 2 of the 3 aquatic habitats. The 500-foot NSO for the 3 habitats will affect approximately 18.3% of the state's mapped streams and is appropriate based on the state of the science as well as 181's directives to be protective. I think it's really important in considering why staff has proposed a very tailored habitat or wildlife habitat specific riparian setback to understand the related protections for water and staff's other proposed rules. So included on this slide is a brief summary of other regulatory provisions from the 300, 400, 600, 800, and 900 series that relate to the protection of surface water. Keeping in mind the breadth of applicable rules helps better understand, again, why staff has proposed a very tailored riparian setback that's focused on the protection of certain aquatic species and habitat. The level of detail and attention paid to protecting water reflects the fundamental understanding we at the Commission share with the rest of Colorado. Water is important. In fact, it is life, and especially in our arid state. Turning now to the next slide. This is a very quick overview, in fact, a table of contents for the structure and flow of the rules. We did make substantive changes in the 100 series, which I discussed at a pretty high level. There are also 2 key provisions in the 300 series are before you, both the alternative location analysis and the CPW consultation process. And finally, there are 3 proposed rules in the 1200 series. 1201, which discusses wildlife related plans and planning. Again, our focus on planning cannot be overstated. Second, 1202C creates the mitigation hierarchy through operating requirements. And finally, Rule 1203 really addresses compensatory mitigation. I won't spend much time discussing this because I think we had a pretty robust discussion when we considered the 900 series, but wanted to remind everyone about the changes that staff proposed in its 900 series presentation to Rule 1202A4. In essence, staff is now proposing that netting and fencing are required for new pits, but for existing pits, COGCC, in consultation with CPW, will evaluate whether fencing and netting is necessary on a case-by-case basis. And again, that case-by-case evaluation will be informed by the produced water characteristics of the fluids in the pit itself. And now it's my turn to turn it over. First, Mr. Ackerman, Brett Ackerman, the Southeast Region Manager with CPW, will spend a little time introducing you to CPW, its experts, and how it's participated in this rulemaking. Again, I could not have asked for a more thoughtful leader and collaborative partner in this process. It's just been a really incredible experience for me professionally. Mr. Ackerman will then turn it over to Caitlin Stafford, and she is one of our new Assistant Attorney Generals, but she has been key in guiding us through the legal landscape related to wildlife resources and also corralling all of our efforts to keep us pointed in the right direction. Ms. Stafford will turn it over to Mr. Duranlo, who you've heard from frequently, to provide a robust discussion of how the rules that we are proposing today implement 181 and are also implementable by our team. He again has deep expertise and vision on this issue, and I look forward to what he has to say today. Mr. Duranlo will then turn it over to Mr. Holst, who is a CPW Southwest Region Energy Liaison. He will be on board to talk about some of the substantive expertise that has informed the wildlife related decisions of the rules. I know that Mr. Ackerman will introduce the entirety of the CPW team, so I certainly don't want to steal his thunder here, except to say that we are before you today because of the commitment, expertise, and dedication that CPW as an organization has given to this effort. I am so grateful for each of their individual contributions. And with that, Mr. Ackerman, I would turn it over to you, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Just making sure you can see my presentation and hear my voice okay. Am I coming through?
We can hear you and we can see your screen. Thank you, Mr. Ackerman.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you for the kind words, Director Murphy. My name is Brett Ackerman. I am CPW's Southeast Regional Manager and a member of our leadership team, and have the opportunity to work together with COGCC on these rules. And I did just want to start by echoing Director Murphy's comments. We've been very grateful for the collaboration and extensive work that's gone into the 1200 series rules. I've said on a number of occasions that, we know that you've gone through several series of rules, but it feels to us like this is the only one you're doing with the level of detail that's gone into this from staff and from the commission. So we're grateful as your sister agency for all the work that this commission and your staff is putting into these rules and the other rules that you've passed. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, I thought I would give you a bit of a brief overview, particularly for those that are listening that may not be as familiar with the relationship between our two agencies. We are an agency under the executive branch and nested under Director Gibbs in the Department of Natural Resources, making us a sister agency to COGCC. We are directed largely by Title 33, Wildlife and Parks Act, and resultant regulations, which I had the pleasure of directing for our agency for a decade. We are commission-led, just like COGCC, and our commission has recently passed a resolution supporting Senate Bill 181 and the resultant regulations. And you can see on this slide that our mission is to perpetuate the wildlife resources of the state, excuse me, to provide a quality state park system, and to provide enjoyable and sustainable outdoor recreation opportunities that educate and inspire current and future generations to serve as active stewards of Colorado's natural resources. In a nutshell, our agency focuses on the out of doors, and we act as the arm of the citizens of this state to help manage the natural resources. In order to accomplish this, we are guided by a number of plans. Our strategic plan is a high-level vision that has overarching goals and objectives and strategies that act as a roadmap for CPW's work into the future. And it was developed with extensive input from the citizens of Colorado. In order to implement that strategic plan, we have operational plans, and we use them on a 2-year rolling basis with actionable targets, indicators, and benchmarks targeted at implementing the goals of the strategic plan. We also have something called the SCORP, the Statewide Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, and that reflects the shared vision and commitment of Colorado outdoor partners to advance recreation, enjoyment, and conservation of all of Colorado's outdoor resources. And then, of course, we have species plans and smaller scale regional plans and area plans and herd plans and property plans, and a number of different plans that help us implement our vision. The plan that you may hear the most about during these hearings is called the SWAP. I think you're familiar with that. It's the State Wildlife Action Plan. And in that plan, we outline and prioritize each of Colorado's wildlife conservation needs, particularly for its species that are the most focused, that need the most focused conservation. It's updated every 10 years in order to continue receiving federal state wildlife grants. And our last update was 2015. The plan encourages and supports conservation actions that address Colorado's species of greatest conservation need. It manages for healthy habitats and ecosystems so that all species can benefit. And it creates a plan, it's intended to create a plan that will be flexible enough to incorporate new research findings and successful management innovations into conservation actions. It acknowledges the pivotal role that private landowners and local stakeholders play in conservation. And it's intended to enhance rather than replace other planning efforts. And I think one of the key points for the purpose of these hearings is that the intent of the SWAP is to maintain an atmosphere of cooperation, participation, and commitment among wildlife managers, landowners, private and public land managers, and other stakeholders in development and implementation of conservation actions. Most of this state, I would say all of this state, all parts, are wildlife habitat to some species or another. And so that necessitates working with all of these partners in order to provide for conservation, but also to provide for other activities on the landscape. Really, our role, Colorado Parks and Wildlife's role in energy and land use, is to provide input to regulatory agencies. While we are a regulatory agency, our regulations generally are associated with the take of wildlife and the use of parks and outdoor recreation spaces. And so for an entity such as COGCC or counties or other regulatory land use entities, we essentially act as a consultant for our sister agencies and for other entities. And what we do when we receive a request for a land use action is we take a look and assess the impacts to wildlife, to its habitat, and to recreational opportunities from those proposals and larger land use planning efforts as well. And we make recommendations to those entities, and Director Murphy noted, avoid, minimize, and mitigate. We generally use that strategy, and we recommend measures to those entities to accomplish those purposes. And then we also help coordinate the implementation of any mitigation efforts that may offset impacts from development activities. So in our role as a consultant, we certainly have given a lot of counsel to counties, to other state agency, to the Public Utilities Commission, and historically COGCC, particularly since the passage of House Bill 1298. So speaking of House Bill 1298, the evolution really of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Oil and Gas land use commenting has we've gone through a number of different phases. We have a land use directive, which we've essentially had for many, many years. And it instructs our staff to respond to written requests from agencies and other entities, as I've just discussed. Generally, the way that we do that is that we have folks spread out across the state on what we call the area level. And our area folks that are most familiar with the habitats to be impacted are generally the folks that comment and provide recommendations to specific land use requests. And with regard to oil and gas, that would happen from time to time, generally with counties, if counties would come to us and ask for potential impacts for proposed oil and gas activity. With the passage of House Bill 1298 in 2007, it directed COGCC to plan and manage oil and gas operations in a manner that balances development with wildlife conservation. And the consultation process was established more formally at that time between Colorado Parks and Wildlife and COGCC. There was a rulemaking, and as you know, you have rules associated with consultation with CPW with regard to proposed oil and gas development. And then, of course, I won't belabor the point that the latest is Senate Bill 19-181, which created the mission shift and shifted a little bit. While certainly COGCC has consulted with CPW and taken a look at wildlife impacts with regard to development, the mission shift in 181 shifted to make sure that development was subject to the protection of a number of things, including wildlife resources. You know, the point here is that land use consulting and planning really is the primary tool for the long-term protection of wildlife and their habitats in this state. And decisions that are made by the regulatory or permitting agencies ultimately, such as COGCC, are what really determine the efficacy of those planning efforts. You know, it's clear 2 times now that the intent of the legislature is to protect Colorado's wildlife and its habitat in perpetuity. As far as land use referrals, we get roughly 1,000 a year. You can see in this table that up to 150 or so of those have been two-way consultations, oil and gas consultations, but we consult on a number of other issues, federal NEPA processes, other large-scale planning efforts, and other county and municipal more specific efforts as well. Colorado Parks and Wildlife brings significant expertise to bear. We have over 120 years managing Colorado's wildlife as the management arm of the people of this state. We're set up, as I mentioned earlier, with local field staff, which we call district wildlife managers, supervised by area wildlife managers. And we also have local terrestrial and aquatic biologists assigned across the state. Those field staff level folks work under a concept of generalist management. And those generalist managers are backed by a wide array of specialists that we employ in the state as well. And I'll get into that here in just a minute. Generally, the concept that we use, a bit of Wildlife Management 101, is that it's important to understand that wildlife management really offers a range of management options. In order to protect the species, we have to work within the biological parameters of the ecology and habitat needs of that species. But within that, there really is a wide range of management options. And so besides those biological parameters, you know, we certainly examine and reach out to the public on desired outcomes, desired sizes of herds, for example. And a lot of societal will is implemented with regard to wildlife management as well, hence the importance of public outreach. And as long as we're working within those biological parameters, there really at many times there are a number of ways that we can work to manage wildlife successfully. There are many methods available, and some are available in some places and not in others. And so certainly that comes into play. And really, there's a range of data that informs our management. And that ranges from very robust species-specific empirical data and studies, all the way to field management, anecdotal reports, and we take all of those things and everything in between into account when we're considering the management of species. And generally, the most robust data that we have is often responsive to a perceived threat to a species. So those species that are of most conservation concern tend to generate more studies and more data than those species that we believe are doing fine and don't have as much concern over. Another kind of general management rule is that data gaps, where they exist, we don't treat those as justification for no protective action, but rather for a conservative approach while appropriate data is gathered. And so, the lack of specific data really isn't a conclusive way to plan management actions. In the end, we believe it's important to be on the same page as sister agencies. Our missions do overlap in a number of places, and to ensure important implementation of the best management practices available by science, it's important that we remain on the same page. And as Director Murphy talked about earlier, that we continue to line up our respective regulations and practices with the best available science. So as I mentioned, to inform and implement its mission, CPW does employ personnel with a very wide range and depth of expertise. So I wanted to briefly introduce the team that's been working on this issue from the CPW side with COGCC staff. We're split up into 4 regions, and we have assigned to each region a regional energy liaison. We also have land use specialists in each region. And this group of people ranges from 4 to 27 years of professional expertise in the oil and gas industry, in biological research, in legal counsel and law enforcement, and various consulting efforts such as environmental efforts, NEPA, public land policy and planning, and many more. Our specific energy and land use liaisons are in the Northwest. We have Taylor Elm, and Mr. Elm has been CPW's Northwest Region Energy Liaison for the last 3 years. He was a Northwest Region Land Use Specialist for 5 years prior to that, and Mr. Elm leads the Northwest Region response by applying geospatial data, mapping, and analysis to wildlife management decisions and land use planning to protect wildlife resources and habitats. Mr. Elm is particularly skilled with regard to grouse and big game winter ranges. Brandon Moret is our Northeast Region representative. He worked for 15 years as a consulting wildlife biologist on NEPA and land use projects, mainly on the Front Range, before joining CPW in 2016. As the Northeast Energy Liaison, he leads the region's response for a variety of energy and land use proposals. And as our Northern Front Range Energy Liaison, Mr. Moret has a particular focus on the implications of statewide legislation and policy. In our Southwest region, we have John Holst. Mr. Holst has experience working as an attorney and a consulting wildlife biologist for both the public and private sectors. And he's the lead for managing CPW's energy and large-scale developments in the Southwest region. In addition to holding bachelor's and master's degrees in wildlife biology, during which he conducted research on mule deer and elk migration patterns, Mr. Holst also holds a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Colorado. He has a wide background in wildlife management and energy and was hired by CPW specifically to implement policy resultant of House Bill 1298. And he also has particular expertise in coal bed methane evaluation. And finally, in our Southeast region, Dr. Karen Voltura is a PhD wildlife biologist specializing in behavioral ecology and wildlife responses to development. She's the lead for CPW's Southeast region for coordination with all land use and energy development, and she has particular expertise in renewable energy and avian ecology. As I mentioned, we also have land use specialists. These are centered on the West Slope. In the Northwest region, we have Danny Newman and Alyssa Slezak. And in the Southwest region, we have Brian McGee. They have significant on-the-ground management experience in both the public and private sectors. And their primary responsibility is to coordinate CPW responses for most other land use practices outside of energy development, including NEPA, county policy and planning, transportation, and many other fronts. As I mentioned, our field staff is backed up by more specialized staff. In these hearings, you may hear from Mr. Brad Banulis, the Northwest Region Senior Wildlife Biologist, and Dr. Chuck Anderson, who's our mammal research leader. Brad Banulis is our Northwest Region, as I mentioned, Senior Wildlife Biologist, and he coordinates 8 field biologists in the Northwest Region, a sagebrush habitat coordinator, and a pilot, and they gather and evaluate and summarize data on all terrestrial wildlife and habitat resources. His team monitors and manages big game and game and non-game wildlife. They plan habitat improvement projects, and they work cooperatively with federal and state agencies for on-the-ground wildlife biology management in the Northwest region. We have a similar structure in each region. Dr. Anderson has 20 years of experience in wildlife management. He focuses on applied research to enhance wildlife management of large mammals in Colorado. And he has 45 scientific publications that address various aspects of large mammal ecology and management, of which 13 publications focus on mule deer and energy development interactions. For our aquatics team, Josh Nearing, similar to Mr. Banulis, Josh Nearing is our Southeast Region Senior Aquatic Biologist with a similar structure. He supervises a number of on-the-ground aquatic biologists, and he has extensive experience managing and recovering sport fish, particularly native fish and amphibians throughout Colorado. He's also backed by Dr. George Schisler, our aquatic research leader. He's been the supervisor of all fisheries research in this state since 2011 and has over 30 years of experience in fisheries management and research, working for both CPW and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And his main focus of study has been on cold water fishes. And finally, we have 3 other specialists that we've asked to join the team. Dr. Brett Walker is an avian researcher that focuses generally on sage grouse. He conducts cooperative research with landowners and energy companies and government agencies to map and prioritize greater sage grouse habitat. Liza Rossi is our statewide bird conservation coordinator, and her focus is on conserving declining birds, including more than a decade with various species of grouse. She's CPW's representative on the Lesser Prairie Chicken Interstate Working Group, the Central Flyway Non-Game Migratory Bird Technical Committee, and specifically on the Eagle Technical Assistance Team with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And last but not least, Mr. Sacco, Bob Sacco, administers our spatial database engine databases, which serve all of our GIS data. He also coordinates the data for our species activity mapping. And I appreciate your patience in allowing me to run through the expertise of this team that we've put together. We certainly have many more folks that work for the Division of Parks and Wildlife with a variety of expertise levels and specialties. I'm very proud to work for an agency that has a depth of expertise that is really unrivaled across the United States and across the world in implementing the plans of the wildlife management plans of Colorado. We believe this is very important. The work that we do is very important to protecting the Colorado way of life. Wildlife and pristine outdoor recreation are a big part of Colorado's identity and economy, with a $6 billion a year direct impact to our economy. One of the things that I think is great about working with wildlife is that the good news is that everybody loves wildlife. We won't hear anybody during these hearings advocating for injuring wildlife or doing away with wildlife. But we also won't hear anyone advocating for removing humans from the landscape. So from our perspective, and as we've approached these draft regulations, we believe it's imperative to all of us that we decidedly plan for the perpetual well-being of both, which is certainly consistent with the SWAP. Population and development, as you know, continues to increase. We're currently approaching 6 million people in Colorado. We're projected to push 8 million by 20 years from now. And so pressure on wildlife and habitats has increased significantly, will continue to increase, making it more important than ever that we continue to plan for the well-being of wildlife in perpetuity in Colorado. CPW believes that these draft rules provide a strong base for doing just that in conserving Colorado's wildlife and their habitats. So with that, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, I appreciate the time that I've been given here today. And my understanding is that your counsel, Caitlin Stafford, will be joining us next.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. We really appreciate that presentation. I think that it's revealing to all commissioners as well as to the 141 participants to get a sense of the breadth and depth of CPW. It really is awesome. So thank you, and thank you for your great presentation and great work with our staff on this. So thank you, CPW. We'll turn to our Assistant Attorney General at this time. Ms. Stafford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you and we can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'll just start with a big thank you to Mr. Ackerman and Director Murphy, and good morning, commissioners. My name is Caitlin Stafford. I am the Assistant Attorney General serving as counsel to the COGCC staff for the wildlife rules. I'm likely a new face to many of you involved with this rulemaking. So just as a brief background, prior to my current position, I worked in different roles in the federal government where I focused mainly on environmental and administrative law. Consistent with my role, today I will discuss legal issues that have arisen in the context of staff's proposed 1200 series rules. I am planning to discuss 4 main issues, as you can see on my screen here. Collaboration on the rules between the Commission and CPW, the interplay between agencies and governments, issues around high priority habitat, and lastly, compensatory mitigation. So, turning now to the first issue I mentioned, collaboration between the Commission and CPW. As you know, the 1200 series rules are focused on protections to wildlife. During Mr. Miner's previous presentations on the 300 and 800 series, he discussed an important concept, that agencies are creatures of statute. We should revisit this in the 1200 series. State agencies like COGCC and CPW only have the powers that are conferred to them in statutes adopted by the Colorado General Assembly. With respect to wildlife, the General Assembly granted the Parks and Wildlife Commission with the authority to protect, preserve, enhance, and manage wildlife in the state of Colorado. The General Assembly also authorized the COGCC to regulate and minimize adverse impacts to wildlife resources affected by oil and gas operations when it amended the Oil and Gas Conservation Act in 2007 under House Bill 07-1298. Thus, the Commission's authority to protect and minimize adverse impacts to wildlife resources from oil and gas operations partially overlaps with the Parks and Wildlife Commission's general regulatory authority over wildlife. As Mr. Miner discussed in the 900 series presentation, legally, there is no prohibition on 2 state agencies regulating the same activity. Unlike the relationship between different levels of government, there is no, quote, preemption because between state agencies, and it is common for 2 agencies to regulate the same general activity, usually for different reasons. As part of House Bill 07-1298, the Commission was directed to work in concert with CPW to develop and implement consultation procedures, best management practices, and other reasonable measures to conserve wildlife resources. Said another way, the General Assembly directed the Commission and CPW to work together to ensure oil and gas operations occur in a manner protective of wildlife. Those rules were adopted in 2008 as part of the new 1200 series. Now, Commission staff with CPW as its partner have drafted the updated wildlife rules before you in order to meet the requirements set forth in Senate Bill 19-181. These proposed rules envision extensive coordination between the Commission and CPW going forward. This is reflected by the provisions proposed as part of Rule 309E, which sets forth the purpose and process for consultation with CPW when oil and gas development is proposed in high priority habitat and will potentially impact wildlife resources. The purpose of the consultation with CPW is for the Commission and operator to obtain the best available information regarding potential impacts to wildlife resources. And similar to the current rules, CPW may waive formal consultation under certain circumstances. CPW may also make written recommendations to the director about how to best protect wildlife resources and whether permit conditions of approval are necessary. This type of information will be important to both the director and the commission as proposals for oil and gas development are considered. Next, I would like to briefly touch upon agency and governmental interplay when it comes to wildlife protection. Mr. Minor discussed the Commission's relationship with local governments at length during his 300 series presentation. As a brief reminder, because of Senate Bill 19181, the Commission and local governments have co-equal and independent authority to regulate the surface impacts of oil and gas operations. As it relates to this rule series, proposed Rule 309E4B acknowledges the role pre-consultation with a relevant local government may play in the CPW consultation process. However, Senate Bill 19181 did not change the relationship between the Commission and the federal government. As with state agencies and the powers conferred to them by the General Assembly, federal agencies, like the Bureau of Land Management, only have the powers conferred to them in statutes adopted by the United States Congress. Federal statutes, like the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA, explicitly provide that states may continue to regulate oil and gas development that occurs on federal lands. Thus, consistent with prior practice, the Commission's rules will continue to apply to federal surface lands and minerals. The Commission has worked closely with its federal partners for many years through a framework governed by the 2008 Memorandum of Understanding with the Bureau of Land Management and the United States Forest Service, and intends to continue this relationship. Staff's proposed rules concerning wildlife continue to lawfully implement this partnership by proposing rules that provide acknowledgement of such careful coordination with our federal partners, including Rules 309E1F and 309E4B. These rules acknowledge the role federal land management agencies may play in the consultation process with CPW on issues related to wildlife, which should continue the efficient and productive working relationship between federal agencies and Commission staff. This Venn diagram that I have on my screen right now might look familiar. Different versions of it have been used in almost all of the staff presentations. But as a brief reminder, there are various places on this diagram where overlapping authority exists among the Commission, local governments, and the federal government. Generally, the federal government has land use planning authority over its own lands. The proposed rules provide for consideration of federal plans as part of the consultation process. And in addition, the Commission retains authority to regulate environmental impact and wildlife resources on federal lands within the state of Colorado. While not on this diagram, it should be reiterated. CPW has the authority to manage wildlife within the state of Colorado. Next, I will turn to high priority habitat to discuss two subtopics. First, I will talk about the interplay between the maps and the Administrative Procedure Act. Second, I will talk about the scientific evidence the staff and CPW reviewed to develop habitat and setback distances proposed in Rule 1202C. As you know, the APA provides certain requirements that state agencies must follow when adopting rules and procedures. On this slide, I've included a screenshot of staff's proposed definition of high priority habitat. The highlighted portion sets out the process by which staff proposes these maps will be updated. CPW's maps are proposed to be adopted as a COGCC rule so that they may be enforced statewide. On this slide, you'll see I have also included a summary of a few of the requirements found in the APA. The APA allows the COGCC to incorporate all or part of a different agency's codes, standards, guidelines, or rules into the COGCC's rules. This is called incorporation by reference, and it might sound familiar. Mr. Minor discussed this most recently in the 900 series staff presentation. However, the APA also requires that agencies adopt a specific version of that other agency's code, standard, or rule. That means once incorporated, a code, standard, guideline, or rule is locked in time. It does not update automatically if a future change is made. Therefore, if the 1200 series only incorporated by reference the map layers provided by CPW, the Commission's high priority habitat maps would not automatically track with CPW's datasets each time CPW made an update. The APA requires that an agency follow the statutorily set rulemaking process to change rules. Because high priority habitat is a defined term, and the incorporated maps will be a COGCC rule relied upon by operators and the Commission to determine how a proposed location will be reviewed, staff believes that the APA requires a rulemaking to update the maps. A rulemaking will also provide transparency to the updating process. Recognizing that maps are static and habitats are dynamic, staff has proposed to conduct rulemaking frequently, but not more than annually, to update the high priority habitat maps. Staff intends for the map rulemaking to occur on a regular basis, and likely together with rulemaking to update other map layers, like, for example, the disproportionately impacted community data. On my next slide, you'll see the second subtopic I'd like to touch upon with respect to high priority habitat, and it involves the scientific evidence considered by staff in developing the habitats and setback distances listed in Rule 1202C and the habitats listed in Rule 1202D. If this introduction sounds familiar, it's because Mr. Minor addressed this subject back during the discussions of the 600 series. As you recall, there is a legal doctrine called Chevron deference that applies when an agency makes a regulatory decision based on its evaluation of the available science. Chevron involves a dispute about how the US EPA made a regulatory decision when presented with different scientific justifications. The court concluded that when an agency, quote, the court concluded that when an agency interpretation represents a reasonable accommodation of manifestly competing interests, such decision will be entitled to deference. Because you've previously received a robust explanation on this very topic, I will keep my remarks here brief. Over the next few days, you will hear from numerous parties and their expert witnesses about the habitats that have been included as part of Rules 1202C and D. Staff encourages you to keep in mind that different parties may subscribe to different strategies on how to best manage certain species or habitats. In this space, staff has looked to its partners at CPW, whose expertise is focused on wildlife management in the state of Colorado, to help inform its approach to protections for wildlife potentially impacted by oil and gas development. Policymaking in this field frequently involves reviewing different scientific approaches and deciding which approach, based on the information presented, best effectuates the legislature's statutory directive. For this reason, the judicial system recognizes that expert agencies, like the Commission, must be afforded deference to their interpretation of complex scientific or technical matters when they promulgate regulations to implement a statute. So, because of the inherent complexities in weighing scientific evidence, as long as your decision is grounded in a reasonable interpretation of the evidence in the record, the courts will defer to your decision. Staff believes that the species and habitats included in the list in proposed Rules 1202C and D are appropriate under this framework. In developing these two subsections, staff has relied upon the peer-reviewed scientific literature in the record and the expertise of its partner, CPW. Earlier, you heard from Mr. Ackerman about the different approaches to wildlife management. A little later in the presentation, you will hear from John Holst on the methodology that went into the determination of which habitats and species to specifically reference in these rule subsets. Ultimately, staff believes that proposed Rules 1202C and D are consistent with Senate Bill 19-181's changes to the Commission's mission and statutory authority to elevate protections for wildlife resources and are supported by substantial evidence. Finally, I would like to, can you still see my slide too? As indicated, compensatory mitigation refers to the regulatory requirement to offset direct and unavoidable aspects of the Commission's oversight of oil and gas operations that have the potential to impact wildlife. Can you still hear me? Sorry.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. First, Senate Bill 19-181 modified the mitigation requirements appropriate for permit conditions in the Habitat Stewardship Rules provision found at Colorado Revised Statute section 346128, subsection 3. Here, the General Assembly included language Can you guys hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ms. Stafford, hold on just a sec. I think we just had a Zoom crash,
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't just me.
something along those lines. It seems like we're all back up and running now. Our participants are rejoining us. I think what I would suggest is if you could restart your presentation on the compensatory mitigation slide.
Sure.
That's where you started to sort of zoom out.
Okay, and I apologize for that.
Hey, not you. This is all of us. So not a problem. But if we could restart at the compensatory mitigation slide, I think that's where we sort of lost everybody.
Okay.
And
I
you'll
think
need to start sharing your screen
Yep.
again. Too.
Okay. I think that should be shared now.
Yeah, that's the screen that we were unable to hear you.
Okay, okay. I will back up and start again. So, okay. So finally, I guess for the second time, unfortunately with the Zoom crash, I would like to provide a brief overview of compensatory mitigation as proposed by staff in Rule 1203. As indicated on the slide, compensatory mitigation refers to the regulatory requirement to offset direct and unavoidable adverse indirect impacts to wildlife and their habitat after first attempting to avoid and then minimize those impacts. Compensatory mitigation attempts to address and offset environmental harm that occurs due to human activities. Staff has proposed Rule 1203 to address Senate Bill 19-181's modifications to two requirements that impact the Commission's oversight of oil and gas operations that have the potential to impact wildlife resources. First, Senate Bill 19-181 modified the mitigation requirements appropriate for permit conditions in the Habitat Stewardship Rules provision. Here, the General Assembly included language specifically contemplating compensatory mitigation as a permit-specific condition to further wildlife habitat protection, effectively directing the Commission to develop rules for offsite mitigation. Second, the legislation clarified the hierarchy for minimizing adverse impacts to wildlife from oil and gas operations in Section 34-60-103, which I've set out here. Under this rule, as implemented jointly by COGCC and CPW, operators will have a choice between developing and executing a compensatory mitigation plan to address impacts to habitats listed in Rule 1202D, or paying for habitat mitigation to offset the direct and unavoidable adverse indirect impacts to wildlife resources. The director may also grant an exception from the compensatory mitigation requirement following a consultation with CPW. To assist operators, staff has set forth requirements for an adequate compensatory mitigation plan. Rule 1203 also sets forth the direct impact habitat mitigation fee and provides the factors that may be considered by CPW and their determination of whether compensatory mitigation will be required to address unavoidable adverse indirect impacts. That is it for me on my presentation. I will now turn the presentation over to Mr. Duranlo, who will walk you through the proposed wildlife rules with more specificity. And I'll share my screen.
Thank you, Ms. Stafford. Really appreciate your presentation and your great work product here. Mr. Duranlo, you are up.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Assistant Attorney General Stafford. Good morning again, Commissioners. I'm Greg Duranlo, the Environmental Manager. I'm really excited to be here today, not just because this is the last series we are tackling in this mission change effort, but because the rules we are talking about today are so important and so fundamental to what it means to live here in Colorado. Today, I will start by discussing some broad topics embedded in the wildlife rules. Some of these you've already heard about by the previous presenters, and some you will hear about in greater detail later. Then I will walk you through the proposed wildlife rules, primarily the 1200 series, but also with wildlife components nested in the 300 and 500 series. I'll start today by building on what Director Murphy, Mr. Ackerman, and Ms. Stafford have already mentioned, and that is the proposed concept of high priority habitat. Staff proposes that all consultations with CPW be based on a single list of species and habitat, consistent with the way CPW manages their land use consultations statewide. High priority habitat, or HPH, is a list of species and habitats for which CPW has good geospatial data and evidence-based protection strategies that avoid or minimize impacts to the species from encroaching development. In other words, we know where the critters are and we know how to protect them. Although consultation will be triggered for a location proposed in any high priority habitat, there are two subsets of HPH that are explicitly called out in Rule 1202 for specific protection strategies. The first subset, listed in 1202C, are species for which avoidance is the primary means of providing protection, and the list includes lek sites, raptor nests, other sensitive species production areas, as well as certain aquatic habitats. These habitats are known to be the most sensitive to direct impacts, and therefore avoiding those impacts affords the most appropriate protection. This list of HPH is similar to the House Bill 1298 restricted surface occupancy list, but we've strengthened that restriction to be more stringent and are referring to it as a no surface occupancy, or NSO list. The second specific subset of HPH are those for which the density of development is the biggest driver of direct and indirect impacts. These species and habitats primarily include big game and grouse species and consist of habitat that is supportive of and critical to robust populations of these animals. CPW has sufficient data to show the species' responses to increasingly dense development. What this means is that each additional oil and gas location developed in a geographic area causes wildlife to change behavior or adjust their use patterns until the density of development is so great that the impacts from additional pads are indiscernible. You will see that we have deleted the former definitions of restricted surface occupancy and sensitive wildlife areas from the 100 series, as these definitions are now obsolete. The proposed rules include a number of plans that will be submitted with new location applications. The first is the Wildlife Protection Plan. This is required for all locations statewide that are not within high priority habitat. This plan will describe the operator's plans for compliance with Rule 1202A, which are wildlife protections that apply on land statewide. The Wildlife Protection Plan should describe the site-specific manner in which the operator will comply or indicate that a certain subsection is not applicable to the proposed operations. The Wildlife Mitigation Plan is required for all locations within high priority habitat. It may be written to address more than one Form 2A or oil and gas development plan and may be used as a landscape level planning tool. We recognize that there are existing wildlife mitigation plans in place, and we encourage their continued use, provided that they meet the requirements of 1201B and receive written concurrence from CPW. And lastly, if an operator proposes to address compensatory mitigation obligations through performance of a project to offset their direct or indirect impacts or both, they will need to submit for review a compensatory mitigation plan describing their project. The level of detail may vary depending on the scale and scope of the project and valuation goals. Staff has worked very closely with CPW to develop this set of wildlife protection rules consistent with the mitigation hierarchy that's already been discussed and it was clarified by Senate Bill 19-181, which first seeks to avoid impacts, and if that is not possible, then to minimize impacts, and lastly, to mitigate for any impacts that remain. To that end, we address 3 different types of impacts: direct impacts, indirect impacts, and cumulative impacts, which may include both direct and indirect impacts. Direct impacts are those unavoidable impacts directly associated with habitat loss, species mortality, or displacement that will result from the proposed development. Indirect impacts may be avoidable and may occur over long periods of time as the density of development increases. Indirect impacts include functional habitat loss, which would be where the habitat remains, but the species of concern selectively avoid it because of the disruption of development. Indirect impacts also include habitat fragmentation and modified behavioral use of the habitat. Cumulative impacts are the aggregation of direct and indirect impacts over time and space. COGCC, CPW have worked to develop these rules to minimize cumulative impacts through effective planning and the overall protective framework of these rules. This slide shows the indirect and cumulative impacts from development over time in a given section of land. This is a real-world example of indirect impacts to mule deer habitat in the Piceance Basin. Each box represents the same 1 mile by 1 mile section of land. In the first picture, the red line represents an access road, and the small red circle, the first oil and gas location in the section. In the second picture, the green buffer represents the area around the pad and the road that the deer will begin to avoid. According to studies included in the record, mule deer in the Piceance Basin tended to avoid producing well pads at distances up to 400 meters, or approximately a quarter mile from the active pad, but still, with one pad, have room to browse and graze throughout the section. When the second pad is added in the third picture, the area impacted dramatically increases, and deer are squeezed to the margin of the section and may have trouble traversing the area. When the third and fourth pads are added in the fifth picture, the section becomes enormously challenging for deer to use. And in the last pictures with the fifth and sixth pads, there's virtually no more land available for the deer to use. At that point, the cumulative indirect impacts are complete, and that section is functionally lost to the deer. Although deer still may be observed within these areas, it will be in reduced numbers compared to undisturbed habitats, and they will likely be living with increased stress levels resulting from the disturbance and development. Proposed pads that cause direct or unavoidable indirect impacts to wildlife resources are subject to new requirements for compensatory mitigation. Each of the pads shown in the previous slide causes the direct impact of habitat loss, whether they are 4 acres or 15 acres in size. Consolidation of operations is one way to avoid some direct impacts, or could minimize the total number of pads needed in an area. And minimizing pad size overall is an important consideration. Compensatory mitigation for these direct impacts to high priority habitat can be addressed in the form of an offsetting project conducted by the operator, or there is an option for a habitat mitigation fee, which I'll discuss later. And that's been proposed as a flat fee for pads under 11 acres or a site-specific fee for larger pads. For the unavoidable indirect impacts, like those shown on the prior slide, they are most severe after the first pad and up through the 5th pad in a given square mile. Therefore, as additional pads are proposed in a section, they will be evaluated for the necessity and appropriateness of compensatory mitigation for indirect impacts. If COGCC and CPW determine that it is necessary, compensatory mitigation may be achieved through a project or an additional mitigation fee. In this slide, I have diagrammed the compensatory mitigation decision process for high priority habitats, subject to the density determination, those listed in Rule 1202D. As mentioned earlier, under the mitigation hierarchy, the first goal is avoidance of impacts. So during the planning process, including pre-consultation with CPW or through the alternative location analysis process, the operator should be asking, can I avoid these impacts? If they can move the pad, conduct the operations from a different pad, or alter the location in such a way that impacts are avoided, that is the first and best choice. If avoidance is not possible, then the impacts are evaluated. Direct impacts begin with the first pad in a section and must be compensated. Again, the operator may develop a compensatory mitigation project or pay the fee as mentioned. Following that, we can evaluate whether the density of pads warrants additional mitigation for unavoidable indirect impacts. I've used dashed lines to show that even where the pad count falls in the range where indirect impacts are expected to be or normally unavoidable, there are times when, based on the site-specific evaluation, COGCC and CPW may determine that the proposed action does not increase the indirect impacts, and therefore no additional indirect impact mitigation may be required. Now I'm going to go through proposed wildlife rules from 300 to 1200. The rest of my presentation continues to be pretty wordy, so I've included this picture to help remind us of one reason why we're here. An alternative location analysis is required by Rule 304B2 for any new oil and gas location proposed within any high priority habitat. The rule has been structured to allow Colorado Parks and Wildlife to grant a waiver from this requirement during the pre-consultation, and the operator would simply provide the waiver with their Form 2A. This rule is intended to encourage early engagement on location selection to optimize the potential for avoidance of impacts. Like other alternative location analysis triggers, the wildlife trigger is also intended to foster discussions with and involvement by other land managers, including the local and federal governments. Rule 309E modifies the consultation process from current Rule 306C. COGCC and CPW and the regulated community have established a successful wildlife consultation process, and Rule 309E builds upon that foundation to enhance our ability to protect wildlife through avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of impacts. The consult rule encourages early collaboration with experts and land managers and provides for site-specific evaluation to achieve the best outcome for wildlife. This is significant, and so I will repeat it. The goal of our consultation process is to achieve the best outcome for wildlife. We have shifted the burden of initiation of the consultation to the operator because that is both consistent with the encouragement for early pre-application consultation, and it solidifies the operator's obligation to consult about the potential impacts of their proposal, even if the landowner is unwilling or unable to participate. While the surface owner can opt out of the consultation, the operator cannot. Staff proposes additional on-ramps, as Director Murphy discussed, to the consultation process, where the director or CPW identify a need for the consultation in order to inform the director's recommendation to the commission. And we have also included off-ramps from the formal consultation process that apply in certain circumstances. If the operator and CPW work together prior to the operator submitting a permit application and develop appropriate protections for wildlife resources, CPW may waive the consultation and certain other provisions of the 1200 series rules. And the waiver process is designed to allow the operator to submit a written waiver from CPW as part of the permit application for the director's consideration. If the director agrees that the application is protective, despite the waived provisions, she will incorporate that into her recommendation to the Commission. Again, this allows the applicant to proactively work to protect wildlife and habitat. And then they are rewarded for that effort by eliminating the burden of consultation upon submission of their oil and gas development plan. The waiver provision is also different from the variance process, which would be a request from the operator directly from the Commission. And I will add that certainly having a waiver of the rule requirement from CPW would be helpful to the director's recommendation on any variance request that the Commission is considering. This table displays Rule 309E2 and 3, which describe when consultation is required and when it is not. Some significant points to note are that, as mentioned, CPW or the director may identify a need not otherwise required by rule and initiate a consultation. We've also made it clear that it is not just the location that will trigger a consultation, but also the associated access road or pipeline corridor, which can also have impacts. In the past, we've had some operators work cooperatively on this issue and others refuse. Staff has also clarified when consultation is not required due to a waiver from CPW, a previously approved planning document, for example, a Form 2A, comprehensive area plan or wildlife mitigation plan, or a demonstration that the species and habitat are gone. The procedures for consultation have not changed significantly. However, the consultation timeframe is now 60 days. In discussing with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we believe that most consultations will not take this long, consistent with the current timeframes, but that where Rule 1203 requires compensatory mitigation, the calculation of additional fees, or the evaluation of a compensatory mitigation plan will necessitate a longer period to complete the process. Staff has also clarified that a surface owner is well within their rights to deny access for the purposes of an on-site consultation, but such denial doesn't negate the necessity of conducting a consultation, which may include a desktop review, an off-site consultation meeting, and a discussion of best management practices and compensatory mitigation. The outcome of the consultation may include agreed upon best management practices, recommended conditions of approval, a plan for compensatory mitigation, a waiver of specific requirements, or a recommendation on any variance request related to the wildlife protection. CPW may also recommend that the Commission deny a proposed application. It is important to note that the director will not incorporate conditions of approval which affect the surface owner's property or their use of the property without their permission, but conditions of approval which do not impact the property directly, such as for off-site compensatory mitigation, may be added to a permit application. In order to address the aquatic habitats that have been added to the no surface occupancy areas of 1202C, staff proposes that CPW be able to waive the setback provisions for intermittent and ephemeral streams based on their consultation without requiring a specific variance for approval. This allows for a director's exception to those areas as appropriate. Staff believes this provision strikes the appropriate balance to ensure that each application gets adequate review and protection, but it reduces the overall burden on the regulated community, COGCC and CPW staff, and you, the Commission, to process these requests. Ultimately, the outcome of the consultation process is a recommendation from CPW on the Form 2A, which will then be considered by the director in her review and recommendation to the Commission. The provision requiring surface owner agreement for any wildlife-specific condition of approval remains in the rule, respecting the rights of landowners. But now, consistent with the Act, as modified by SB 19-181, off-site compensatory mitigation can be part of the outcome for a permit. Rule 529D provides for consultation by CPW on certain Commission orders. This was an existing provision that didn't belong in the current Rule 306C or proposed Rule 309E, Besides moving it to the 500 series, no significant changes were made to this rule. Now we will move into the specifics of the 1200 series. Rule 1201 describes the requirements of the Wildlife Protection Plan and Wildlife Mitigation Plan. Since I've already discussed these, I won't go into detail other than to repeat that the Wildlife Protection Plan is required for sites that are not in high priority habitat to describe the implementation of the statewide operating requirements. The Wildlife Mitigation Plan is required for proposed sites within high priority habitat and will describe any pre-application consultation, best management practices, specific Rule 1202B requirements, and any mitigation commitments. Rule 1202 provides general operating requirements for wildlife protection both outside and within high priority habitat. Some of these are relatively unchanged from the prior 1200 series. Most have targeted language changes to make them more clear and precise. Staff has also included a new requirement to prohibit vegetation removal during nesting season for migratory birds. And within high priority habitat, we have retained the requirements to require boring rather than trenching for stream crossings and to treat pit water to inhibit mosquito breeding to prevent the spread of West Nile virus. The next two slides walk through the changes in operational requirements from existing rule to proposed. I'd be happy to take any questions later on Rule 1202 requirements, but these slides are probably better digested as you are reviewing these materials on your own. I would, however, like to call your attention to 1202A4 at the bottom of the page and reiterate that we are proposing to modify this from what staff originally proposed in the October 9th draft so that it only applies to new pits, but allows for a case-by-case determination for fencing and netting of existing pits. This is consistent with the discussions that took place during the 900 series rulemaking and deliberations. This slide shows the last 4 statewide operating requirements. And again, I'll direct your attention to the bottom of the page. Rule 1202A8 is a new provision to prohibit vegetation removal during the nesting season of migratory birds to prevent accidental take. If the operator must start clearing during the time between April 1st and August 31st, then they either need to conduct hazing activities to prevent birds from nesting in their project area, or they must conduct a survey for nesting birds and then provide protective buffers around any active nests. Again, operators will describe how they will comply with these statewide provisions in their wildlife protection plans. So in the case of fencing, for example, the wildlife protection plan would indicate the operator will be using an 8-foot fence with a full-size gate as recommended in CPW's handbook, Fencing with Wildlife in Mind, to exclude deer and elk from the proposed location. The habitats and management areas listed in Rule 1202C1 are the most sensitive wildlife resources in the state, and avoidance of these areas as the single most protective strategy is supported by robust data provided by CPW in the administrative record. While similar to the former RSO list, restricted surface occupancy, there have been some changes based on the data and observations made over the last dozen years. In addition to the grouse species and raptor nest protections, we've added back bat hibernacula for 3 species, least tern and piping plover production areas, and state wildlife areas and state parks. The statement of basis and purpose discusses the rationale for those changes. And we also removed Swainson's hawk from an earlier draft of the 1200 series. A significant change that you've already heard about and will definitely hear more about first from John Holst and later from many stakeholders is the inclusion of additional aquatic habitat plus a 500-foot buffer from the ordinary high water mark of certain streams and rivers. As Mr. Holst will explain, the additional protected species and wider aquatic buffers results in a significant increase in the overall acreage of protected lands. But we have also recognized that where the protected waterway is an ephemeral drainage or intermittent stream, a site-specific evaluation may lead CPW to waive the applicability of the 500-foot setback during the Rule 309E consultation. Rule 1202C also lists several activities at existing oil and gas locations when the NSO is not applicable, including maintenance and repairs where a rig will not be required, emergency operations, spill response, ongoing reclamation and site maintenance, habitat improvements, and commission or director requested work. The rule also requires for non-emergency workovers, plugging, and other intensive work that will require a rig or heavy equipment and earth moving, when the operator first consults with CPW, the director approves, and the operator takes measures to minimize adverse impacts. Rule 1202D lists the species for which it is known that increasing the density of development causes increasing impacts. These are primarily big game species and grouse production areas, and this list is similar to the current sensitive wildlife habitat list. First, it is known that direct impact in the form of habitat loss will occur with each pad in these habitats. And as shown earlier, indirect impacts occur after the first pad and until approximately the fifth pad in a given square mile or section of land. With additional pads beyond the fifth, the impacts start to become less and less pronounced and are quickly indiscernible. Therefore, after the first oil and gas location in a section within the habitat listed in Rule 1202D, the operator will include a plan to address compensatory mitigation in their wildlife mitigation plan. I've discussed this earlier, but just to reiterate, an operator may fulfill its obligation for compensatory mitigation in one of two ways, either by conducting a mitigation project or by paying a mitigation fee. These two options may be used for either direct or unavoidable indirect impact mitigation. If the operator chooses to conduct a mitigation project, then they will submit a compensatory mitigation plan for approval. This slide lists the typical components of a mitigation plan, and the project and plan will be tailored to the scope and scale of the impacts being offset and the project valuation. The director will consult with CPW to ensure that the project and plan are appropriate. It is these consultations that are expected to take a bit longer, and this is one of the primary reasons for the longer 60-day consultation timeframe provided for in Rule 309E. If the operator chooses to pay a fee, there are two fees to consider. The direct impacts habitat mitigation fee, shown on this table, and the indirect habitat mitigation fee that I will describe in a moment. As shown, for pads less than 11 acres, we are proposing a flat fee of $13,750. This fee amount was calculated based on average pad sizes over the last 11 years in these habitats, as Mr. Holst will describe in more detail shortly. If there is a need for the location larger than 11 acres, then COGCC and CPW will determine a site-specific amount during the consultation process. The indirect impact mitigation process involves more detailed considerations on a case-by-case basis. First, an assessment of the density of pads will be conducted. Then a determination of whether compensatory mitigation is appropriate will be made. And if it is determined that mitigation is appropriate, then a determination of the valuation will be made. This will include details about the proposed development, proposed protective siting measures included in the plans, the duration of the project and technology, and practices used to minimize the impacts. Using this information and in consultation with CPW, the director will determine the appropriate fee to compensate for unavoidable indirect impacts. With that, I will turn this presentation over to John Holst, Southwest Regional Energy Liaison for CPW. He and his colleagues have been amazing partners over the last 12 years of implementing House Bill 07-1298, also known as the Colorado Habitat Stewardship Act, and have done an immense amount of research and work to support the drafting of these proposed rules. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Appreciate that presentation. Mr. Holtz, I think you're up.
John Holst. I am the Southwest Region Energy Liaison for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. As Mr. Ackerman mentioned, I was hired in 2007 specifically to help the agency implement House Bill 1298. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to use my time today to give you some background and a little more detail on 6 of the issues that were highlighted in the party statements. The first, of course, is high priority habitat, specifically where that term comes from, a little bit about its history. Then I'd like to look at some maps and show you where high priority habitat exists on the landscape, and specifically give you a comparison of the old House Bill 1298 restricted surface occupancy habitats as compared to the new Senate Bill 181 1202C habitats. After that, we'll look at the definition of grouse and prairie chicken leks that were used for the new rules. And we'll also give you a description of the proposal that we came up with COGCC for how to deal with big game migration corridors in the new rules. There were some questions in the party statements about how we came up with our compensatory mitigation calculation, that flat fee for well locations under 11 acres. And so we'll talk a little more detail about that. And then lastly, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the timing of consultation and how we see that going forward as compared to how consultation exists today. So high priority habitat, where did it come from? Ironically, it actually really did come from this commission, but a previous iteration of it. Back in 2008, COGCC asked Colorado Parks and Wildlife to come up with a list of species and habitats needing regulatory protection under House Bill 1298. In order to do that, we looked at all economically important species in the state, as well as species in greatest need of conservation via our State Wildlife Action Plan, our SWAP. And we did come up with a list, and internally, we actually referred to that list back in 2008 as our high priority habitats. In order to make the list and fit into the 1298 regulations, we actually needed 2 things. Mr. Duramo mentioned these. The first, we needed spatially explicit, robust GIS data about where the species and habitat feature exist on the landscape. So we do need to know where it exists. Secondly, we needed site-specific recommendations based upon the best available science about how to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts from oil and gas activities. So if a species, regardless of its status, did not meet those 2 criteria, it did not make the list. In 2009, COGCC did adopt a subset of our high priority habitat list as sensitive wildlife habitat and restricted surface occupancy areas under the 1298 rules. Shortly after that, CPW really saw the value in having a statewide list of consistent recommendations for these high priority habitat species and habitats. And so we adapted the list in 2010 and began using it and those recommendations for other types of land use activities statewide. And we continued using that same list and those same recommendations up until last year. In 2019, we completed a 12-month review of our high priority habitat list and the recommendations associated with those habitats. That review, once again, included a review of all economically important species in the state, as well as all Tier 1 and Tier 2 species identified in our SWAP. A good example of that carried over into the draft rules you have before you is the native fish and other native aquatic species conservation waters. That layer encompasses habitat for 32 species from our SWAP, including boreal toads. So this really bright map gives you an idea of how high priority habitats lay across the landscape in Colorado. The high priority habitats that are the consultation triggers under Senate Bill 181 are shown in red, and overlaying on top of those in green are the old sensitive wildlife habitat and restricted surface occupancy layers from House Bill 1298. So you can see how they compare. There were some expansions across the state. Most of the larger blocks of terrestrial habitats actually were added to the eastern portion of the state. but a lot of the aquatic layers that you can see here were added all across the state. And there is a link there if folks want to look at that on our webpage. So this is really all of the consultation layers that are habitat related under the new rules and what existed under the old rules. This map refines that down to the House Bill 1298 restricted surface occupancy layers, which are shown in green. Those are overlaying on top of the Senate Bill 181 1202C habitats shown in red. Again, you can see that there were some additions statewide, but really the vast majority of the additions are those linear aquatic habitats shown here. This table kind of sums it up for you. Using that same color scheme, in green on the left are the 1298 restricted surface occupancy habitats. In the center in red are the Senate Bill 181 1202C habitats in comparison. Then on the far right, highlighted in the yellow column, is the change in acreage associated with that change. So I'll direct your attention to the, I guess, the last 3 or 4 rows of this table. And you'll see that the addition of those 3 or 4, or those 3 aquatic layers specifically, added a significant amount of acreage. Of the 6.5 million acres total that the 181 changes added to the 1202C layers, about 5.7 million acres of that was from those 3 aquatic habitats alone. And again, this is a look at that map so you can see how those aquatic habitats lay out statewide. It is a dramatic increase in the number of acres protected under the new rules. To give you the background, though, there is a significant amount of aquatic habitats in the state that are not covered under the new rules. This map shows you all the stream segments in the state that are mapped by the USGS in their National Hydrography Dataset, shown in blue. Overlaying on that blue layer in red is the combination of native fish and other native aquatic species conservation waters and sport fish management waters. And so those 2 layers amount to just under 16.5% of all of the stream segments in the state. If you add in cutthroat waters and the additional 500-foot buffer that were added to that layer, it's still less than 18.5% of all waters of the state, all stream segments. So based on the feedback that we got from some of the stakeholders and the difficulty in managing around some of those long linear aquatic buffers, we did make some changes to the rules, and I think both Director Murphy and Mr. Duranlo referred to some of these changes. The first was we added Rule 1202C2C to specifically allow access road and utility construction across those aquatic buffers, provided that the operator does consult with us and do what they need to do to protect that resource. Second, we modified Rule 309E5D to streamline, essentially allow for us to waive those buffers where it was appropriate for intermittent and ephemeral drainages associated with native fish and sport fish waters. And lastly, this wasn't a change, but I'll just highlight it for you. Director Murphy mentioned it. Rule 309E3C(i) allows for waiver of consultation if the species and its habitat is no longer present and unlikely to return to an area. So how this might apply specifically in the aquatic context is if there is, for example, an ephemeral drainage that we did map incorrectly, and we go out and visit with an operator on site and determine that it was mapped incorrectly, we have the ability to essentially say a consultation is not required for that feature. On to LEC buffers. There were some questions in the party statements about what layers we used for our LECs. For the purpose of the rules, a LEC site refers to a CPW mapped LEC that has seen activity at any time within the last 10 years. CPW mapped LECs that have not seen activity in the last 10 years are considered historic and were not forwarded to COGCC for the rulemaking. So that transition from active LEC to historic LEC does have consequences. Again, back to this comparison table between 1298 and Rule 1202C. If you look at the 5th and 6th rows down, I bracketed Gunnison sage-grouse LECs and lesser prairie chicken LECs. Although we did not propose to change the buffer for Gunnison sage-grouse LECs, you'll see that the actual acreage protected under the new rules decreased. That is specifically because of that transition from active LECs to historic LECs. We did lose some LECs. Similarly, but a little different, for lesser prairie chickens, we proposed an increase in the LEC buffer. And although we did have that increase, the actual acreage covered in the rules did not change dramatically. And that again is because we lost some lesser prairie chicken LECs between the old rules and the new rules. Migration corridors. Couple things for the commission to be aware of. There is state and federal policy out there applicable to Colorado on winter range and migration corridors for big game. Last year, Governor Polis signed an executive order on conserving Colorado's big game winter range and migration corridors. My commission, the Parks and Wildlife Commission, also signed a resolution supporting the implementation of that executive order. That executive order has some specific requirements in it for state agencies, especially for DNR and CDOT. But the gist is essentially that we are to do everything that we can to try and protect migration corridors and winter range for big game in Colorado. And this rulemaking and our involvement in it at CPW and COGCC is part of that implementation. In addition, there is some federal policy. Department of Interior issued Secretarial Order 3362 in 2018 on improving habitat quality in western big game winter range and migration corridors. And so there's really an alignment of both federal and state policy on this issue. There's also a tremendous amount of stakeholder interest in migration corridors and, as importantly, big game seasonal ranges, winter range, especially in Colorado, because winter range is limiting. So we recognize that. We do agree that the best available science supports protecting migration corridors by avoiding the placement of facilities in key stopover areas and pinch points within migration corridors. CPW doesn't currently map stopover areas and pinch points within broader migration corridors. And there are some reasons for that. The first being that for the herds that we do intensively manage, it does appear that the character of migration in Colorado is somewhat different than it is in other states where migrations have been mapped and stopover areas have been identified. The second is that although we do collect a significant amount of data on select herds statewide for survival purposes and for research purposes, we don't have uniform data for all herds statewide. And so we don't really have a way to prioritize migration corridors one to the other or a stopover or pinch point one to the other. I'll show you how this looks with a couple of maps. So this is an example from Wyoming where they have mapped a long linear migration corridor. You can see this is the Hoback Basin mule deer to red desert, or red desert to Hoback Basin mule deer migration. The red desert is in the south, that's winter range, and they migrate north to summer range. You can see it as a long linear migration, highlight or shown in brown. And in green is where the folks doing this research have identified some stopover areas. And if you look real closely, they've actually identified some pinch points as well that include some highway crossings and fence crossings and things like that. So if you compare this map to this one, this map was created using a very similar technology, essentially GPS transmitters affixed to mule deer as they're migrating across the landscape. This is our White River herd, our D7 herd. You'll note that we did not identify any stopover areas or pinch points. You'll also note that this is a much different looking migration than what was shown on the last slide. This is essentially a large landscape scale movement dispersed broadly across the landscape. Winter range is on the left here generally, migrating to higher elevations on the right side of the slide. And so you can see in this context, it is much more difficult to identify stopover areas and pinch points. So with this in mind, we worked with COGCC to include migration corridors along with winter range in Rule 1202D. As a refresher, the 1202D is where we're asking operators to limit the density of their well locations to 1 per section, or if they cannot do that, to come up with an effective way to mitigate both the direct and indirect adverse impacts to that habitat. And really, our desire here is to try and keep the entire landscape functional and permeable so that big game can continue to move freely across the landscape and migrate as they normally would. And we do think that this approach is supported by the literature that we've referenced in the Statement of Basis of Purpose. On to our compensatory mitigation calculations. We did recommend a flat fee for direct impacts for well locations of 11 acres or less than 11 acres. As Mr. Gronlow mentioned, we looked at the average well location disturbance over the last several years. That was just under 6 acres. That disturbance can be split out into what portion was short-term disturbance, the portion that's essentially reclaimed during the interim reclamation while the well goes into production, and the portion that is long-term disturbance, the portion that remains disturbed for the life of the well. Then for the portion that's disturbed for the short term, we looked at our CPW internal average cost, what it would take us to improve an equivalent amount of habitat to offset that short-term habitat loss. It's important to note here that we looked at our cost of actually doing the work. We did not look at the cost of conserving that equivalent amount of habitat. So this is literally if we have a willing landowner and we go out and do the improvement on their property, or if we do it on federal lands, the BLM or the Forest Service, that's what it would cost us. For the long-term disturbance, we looked at the average cost to offset that with conservation. We looked at 5 years of DOLA conservation easement appraisal values and took an average across the state, and that's how we came up with that value. Then we simply added that short-term calculation with the long-term calculation to come up with our $13,750 fee. We did round down about $100. And lastly, on the timing of consultation, consultations currently take typically less than 40 days, sometimes significantly less than 40 days. We do think that that pre-application coordination that's facilitated by the alternative location assessment will actually make consultation for wells that do not require compensatory mitigation probably even more streamlined, so they'll probably take less time. The additional 20 days will, however, be needed when we do have to come up with a compensatory mitigation project with an operator that they're willing to do to offset that impact, or when we need to negotiate an additional compensatory mitigation fee for indirect impacts. I will say that once we had done that and kind of negotiated a compensatory mitigation framework with an operator, subsequent consultations on locations in that same area will likely be streamlined. It will take less time. And that really concludes, I guess, the formal portion of my presentation. Before I turn it back to Director Murphy, I would just like to echo my thanks to Director Murphy and her staff for working very closely with us, not just on this rulemaking, but over the last 12 to 13 years to actually implement the rules. We have learned a tremendous amount over the last decade or so, and I think a lot of the lessons that we've learned are reflected in this staff package that you have before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holtz. Really appreciate your presentation. Good to work with you again. Director Murphy, did you have any closing commentary?
I have just a couple of things. One, I hope now with kind of the complete picture, you've been able to see the degree of expertise that our agency, COGCC, has the benefit of working with at CPW. And I'd also note that this is wrapping up staff's 8th of 8 rule presentations, which is really exciting. I mean, let's go ahead and do a victory dance now. And in true kind of 2020 form, we started the 200 through 600 series with a Zoom crash, nationwide or worldwide, and had another mini crash in the middle of this morning's presentation. So thanks for rolling with us through it. We did take a little longer than I anticipated, and I think we could probably all use 10 minutes to refresh ourselves and stretch our legs. But with that, we would be, the collective we, are available for your questions, commissioners.
Great. Thank you very much, Director Murphy. Thank you to your staff. Thank you to CPW staff for their presentations this morning. Let's do that. Let's take a 15-minute break. So let's come back at 11:17. We just had our morning break on the 1200 series. We had a presentation from staff as well as from CPW on the series that has been developed for our consideration. We now have approximately, 45 minutes, an hour before our lunchtime break. And now is the opportunity for commissioners to ask questions of staff. I guess we kind of would hope that we've got most of our staff available, because the questions may go to various folks with expertise. So with that, I would turn to commissioners and ask folks who would like to go first. We received a lot of information. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the staff's presentation, and very glad to have the direct presentation from the CPW staff as well. I think that was really helpful. There were, as they all know, and Director Murphy and Mr. Duranlo know, we've had a few discussions about the rules, myself and those folks, and I've asked a lot of questions, and so some of them I'm going to re-ask for the benefit of the record. But I do really appreciate just all the thought and care that's gone into the development of the rules as they are in the current draft. So thank you all for all your efforts. One question I had was related to the updating of the high priority habitat maps, which of course has come up from several stakeholders, and I know that we had the presentation from Ms. Stafford about how the APA comes into play. We had at least one comment about how this being subject to rulemaking, the updating of the maps, goes beyond what is required under the Administrative Procedures Act. And I wondered if we could have either Ms. Stafford or one of our other AAGs give us a little bit more information on that.
Ms. Stafford.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. And thank you for your question, Commissioner Nanjapa. As I discussed in my presentation, staff believes that it is prudent to subject the high priority habitat layers, prudent to subject these updates to a rulemaking. This will ensure transparency, as I mentioned, and also another thing I mentioned in my presentation is that the extent of these maps, it really is the rule here. This is what operators and the commission will look to determine the extent of these high priority habitat areas. So, based on some of these understandings, staff would like to move forward and conduct a rulemaking, believing that it is the most appropriate mechanism to update these maps. If Mr. Davenport wants to chime in and clarify anything that I've said or Also, if he has any additional thoughts on this, I would welcome that, as he is your legal counsel. But that that is the staff's position on that matter.
AAG Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to start by apologizing. I had some internet issues and the sound cut out a couple of times for me, so I may reiterate some points or miss some points. But ultimately, in my view, what the staff has proposed is that the commission adopt maps as a rule. And when the commission adopts rules, it must conduct a rulemaking to change those rules, and that includes the maps themselves. I don't know if that clarifies or adds any. I'm happy to continue.
AAG Minor, I might just follow up on that point. Is there any other way of doing it? Because we've had, a lot of folks that want to make sure that the maps are as up to date at all times as possible. But I know we've heard from you and our attorneys that when you adopt a map, you've got to adopt something that's static. I mean, have we peered around the corners? Is there any other way to allow CPW's maps to be more sort of consistently up to date as they update them?
Mr. Chair, I don't think there is. I fully agree with my colleagues, AAG Stafford and AAG Davenport, that for this type of regulatory requirement where another agency's standards are being brought into the commission's rules, the APA just doesn't allow future versions of those rules to be incorporated. And I mean, that this is fully consistent with how other incorporations by reference that involve mapping characteristics have been treated in other series. So you might recall the mapping characteristics brought in from the Department of Health and Human Services, the American Community Survey, and EPA for the definition of disproportionately impacted communities. We are fixed in time on those. You may remember Ms. Trask recommending that there be a similar sort of periodic rulemaking to update those maps as new census data comes in. Similarly with the Rule 411 maps of public water systems, those are sort of a static incorporation, and that's true for every other regulation and standard that's incorporated into the commission's rules. So staff, supported by all of the attorneys, have worked really hard to ensure that all of the standards and orders and maps incorporated from other agencies fully comply with the APA incorporation by reference requirements throughout all of the rule series.
Thank you, AAG Minor. I appreciate that clarification. And Commissioner Najapa, I did not mean to steal your questions. You still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all three of the AAGs for assisting on that question. That was helpful. I did have a similar follow-up question as what you just asked, Chair Robbins, so thank you for asking that. The other piece of that I was curious about is does, since this is related, well, this is of course specifically to the high priority habitat and the designation thereof through rulemaking, does that mean that if CPW has updated their maps internally, they are unable to consult those, their internal updated maps for the purposes of their consultation with us, unless there's been a rulemaking change?
Which one of our AAGs wants to swing at that question?
Mr. Robbins, or excuse me, Chair Robbins, if I could pass that off to Ms. Murphy.
Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And I may, call for backup from Greg. I think the point is that within, once adopted, the maps are static until they are updated via rulemaking. However, I think that to me is really the importance of both the on and off ramps that we built into Rule 309, both so that if habitat or wildlife move outside of those maps, there's the opportunity for CPW to request consultation. And I think that you've heard from Brett and Mr. Ackerman, and particularly about the breadth of the team that they have on the ground, understanding the actual landscape. And so they can draw on that expertise in evaluating whether a 2A needs consultation that isn't necessarily within a mapped area. Conversely, if the map hasn't changed and some sort of surface development has come in, whether it's a parking lot, or something else, there's the opportunity to give an off-ramp to that consultation because the species and habitat are no longer present. And so that's how we try to build flexibility into the interim periods when things change before the maps change. That being said, we think it's absolutely imperative that these maps be updated annually or at least every 2 years to stay current with CPW's recommendations and reflect the best available information. So.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Mr. Duranlo, did you want to add anything to that?
I think Director Murphy hit the nail on the head, and thank you, Chairman. I would note that a very early draft that we put forward did not have the same sort of requirement. My desire originally was really to say, let's just incorporate the maps as they are updated. Let's let's always have the most current. And I think the problem with that is that it doesn't create a great deal of certainty for us or the regulated community in how we implement. And so having a regular cycle for updating, and that's why staff has requested that the commission sort of take this on a routine and regular basis to keep the maps up to date.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Director Murphy and Mr. Duranlo. That was helpful as well. I think your point, or the points made previously about the transparency of that process and the certainty of those maps during that period is helpful. The last question I had on this topic is, given that there have been various comments and questions related to other priority species in the state of Colorado that are not considered part of the high priority habitat list of species, there are these various provisions that you went through that allow for additional consultation with CPW, where there may be some site-specific considerations based on those species. I just wanted to confirm or just sort of hear a little bit more from either COGCC staff or the CPW staff about how that sort of works. So in the event that OGDP is filed, and there is recognition that particular site has a sensitive species, could you just kind of elaborate a little bit further on that process that you undertake?
To whomever wants to respond, unmute yourself, please. Mr. Holtz.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Ninjaba. So that is a great question. We can actually, per that on-ramp provision that Mr. Duranlo and Director Murphy mentioned, CPW staff can use that as to request a consultation, and we do typically look at every e-notification that we get through the e-permit system. So our regional energy liaisons and land use staff, we get a notification of permits that are filed, whether they occur within high priority habitat or under the old rules, sensitive wildlife habitat, or restricted surface occupancy areas. So we will continue to do that under the new rules. And if, for example, something that's not listed like swift fox, it's not on the list because we don't have a good map of active swift fox dens. If our staff in the field knows that there's an active swift fox den where there is a proposed well location, then we will request a consult and try and deal with that situation in that manner. We're kind of forced to do it that way because we don't have good distribution maps for some of these habitat features, for some of these species that are still species of conservation need. We just don't have great maps, so we can't put them out there as a consultation trigger. We need to rely on our field staff to bring them up when it's appropriate. And it does put a fair amount of pressure on our local district wildlife managers and biologists and regional energy liaisons to do that. But I think that's really the only way we can handle those species.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mr. Holst. And it seems that that you all emphasize this in your presentation, but just the pre-consultation that can really get at this quite a bit and can help streamline the process. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have other questions, but I'll step back in case there are other commissioners that want to jump in.
Not Commissioner Gonzalez and then Commissioner Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to piggyback on a question about mapping in general. And I think I asked this during the 1200 discussion I had with CPW staff a few weeks ago, and I can't recall the answer. I can't find it in my notes, so I'm gonna ask it again. How are these kind of buffer layers created, right? You know, the buffers around the riparian habitat, the buffers around the habitat around Lex, you kind of have, I assume there's a point, and the buffers created around that. Those are known species habitats. But I'm curious about, you know, the movement of rivers, the movement of waterways, how those buffers change, if they're surveyed, if they're modeled. How does that get into the map?
Mr. Holtz.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Gonzalez. So, you know, as part of our regular map updates that we do internally, you know, we do modify the layers. Example I'll give you is raptor nest layers. So, you know, that's an easy one because that's a discrete point on the landscape. But if a raptor nest becomes inactive, then that nest falls off, and that buffer associated with that nest then would no longer appear on our maps that we forward to COGCC. Rivers are more difficult. You know, we rely on a variety of databases like that, what I showed you, the USGS National Hydrography data set, and some of those to actually get the center line for those rivers to map the buffer. And so those are probably more stagnant and may not be as accurate over time. So those are some things that would, you know, need to be ground truth potentially as we go out in the field. So there is a variety of ways that those are mapped, I guess, is the best answer. We try and use the best information available and the most current.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Thank you for the reminder on that. Is there, I mean, do you guys find there's like a standard margin of error that you see with some of these buffer mapping, you know, some of these ArcGIS modeling efforts?
Commissioner, Mr. Holtz.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would have to say that it is variable. You know, it goes to the quality of the data and the frequency of the update. And so it's in some ways, you know, variable by sort of species or species group, depending on, you know, who's collecting the data and where we're getting that data set from. So I don't think we really have a standard error. Some of it's quite accurate, but like that, I think you know, some of it that's more static is probably not as accurate.
Thank you, Mr. Holtz.
Commissioner Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to echo too some of the comments earlier. Thank you, Ms. Murphy, and the presentation by staff, and John Holtz and Brett Ackerman and all your team at CPW. You know, this is a big DNR family right now, so I feel like I have brothers and sisters on both sides of this. I'm really proud of the great and hard work you all put in on this presentation. It's very impressive. Just to follow up on some of the map questions, I know we'll hear from operators too on their take on this, and I'm sure we'll hear that they would want, you know, certainty in terms of the landscape. You know, what can we do to help provide the certainty? Can we get maps done, you know, annually by January 1st, for example? You know, so it's, you know, defined at a certain date every year. Or I know we want to have the best available science and timing available, but just wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, I know annually, ideally, maybe every 2 years if we have to, but could it be, you know, every January 1st, for example? Is that a possibility?
Mr. Ackerman.
Thanks, Director Gibbs, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Brett Ackerman, Southeast Region Manager for CPW, and we are constantly updating maps, and we certainly have some flexibility to be able to do that in different ways than we currently do. So in answer to Director Gibbs's question, yes, we can modify if we think that that's necessary. A little more detail that, you know, we might update, for example, raptor nests on maps as they come in, and so we might be constantly updating a map like that. We do have other maps that are really on a cyclical process, and we might update big game maps in a specific region on 1 year, and then we rotate from region to region a different year. So some of those maps might be only updated every 4 years. So yes, we would be able to update maps each year with the cycles that we've gone through. And if needed, we could adjust those cycles if it was helpful to do so.
Great, thank you. And thank you for that question, Commissioner Gibbs. And I guess I would just sort of, throw out there with the full-time commission, we have capacity to be able to undertake yearly updates, perhaps better than with previous formations of commissions. Other questions on the HPH maps? Commissioner Messner.
Well, I wasn't really going to talk about the maps, but I can because I did have a question. And this is just thinking aloud. But, I anticipate we're going to go through a number of rulemakings each year. I mean, and it may not be a number, but it may be some amount of rulemakings each year. How problematic would it be to just automatically incorporate map update to each rulemaking that we may undertake? So rather than having it on January 1st every year, just say each time we're doing a rulemaking, we're also publicizing that we're going to be updating not only the wildlife maps, but it sounds like the water maps and some other maps that may need periodic updating. Is that more problematic than just having an annual January 1st update? Or
Director Murphy?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. I think that will be a little bit up to the commissioners themselves, right? To presume that there will be a mapping update available with every rulemaking that we undertake requires a crystal ball that I don't have. And so I think instead making sure that our commissioners are committed to an annual update in some way, shape, or form makes a little bit more sense to me. And it's just something we all need to keep fairly top of mind, I think. And as we're preparing there are certain documents that we have to prepare whose name escapes me right now to predict for the legislature what rulemakings we would be undertaking. We can help include or plan to include mapping on it, and that will again keep it at the forefront of all of our minds. And I think our stakeholders will be pretty engaged in making sure that we continue to provide those updates so that we again have certainty and can reflect the best available information.
Commissioner Messner?
can we go to another topic, or should we stay on this one for a little longer?
It's up to the pleasure of the commission. I think we can jump around, and I don't think there's a problem with that.
Okay. If I could, I'd like to go to just kind of a little broader in-depth discussion around, as we're looking at applications and applying these rules, these standards, how that decision-making will happen between avoid, minimize, and mitigate, understanding that it seems in a wildlife perspective that mitigation seems to be contemplated primarily as a compensatory mitigation. So I guess my question is, are we inadvertently going to a de facto compensatory mitigation, or are we still looking at these applications as they're coming in as the primary goal is to avoid and to minimize, compensatory mitigation being more of a last resort type of situation? And then how does that balance between denial of an application versus compensatory mitigation?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Commissioner Messner. That was actually a question I had and I'll just sort of throw this out there, and I think that we can hear from everybody, but how do you make a determination that compensatory mitigation is an appropriate solution in terms of dealing with unavoidable and indirect impacts to wildlife versus just denial is the way to go? Mr. Duranlo?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Commissioner and Chairman. So it is well within, the rule provisions for CPW to look at an application and recommend denial. That is certainly an outcome of consultation. But I want to be clear that we believe that our rules are structured such that, like 1202C, the no surface occupancy, that is hitting the avoidance mechanism of the mitigation hierarchy. if we are talking about mitigating impacts and having compensatory mitigation, then certainly we have not avoided impacts. There are unavoidable impacts to that application. So, you know, that said, I think that's the consideration that staff has to make, the director has to make, pulling in the you know, the consultation information from our partners at CPW to determine whether the overall habitat can handle the level of impact that we're seeing from an individual application, or that the species can handle the impact that we're seeing from that from that application. And I'd certainly let you know, our partners at CPW chime in on how they will, you know, manipulate that information in their consultation.
Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think Mr. Duranlo is right on there. And this, you know, I would add to the following of the hierarchy discussion that this also illustrates the wisdom of the rules, I think, as proposed, because it does create a situation where we do have wide swaths of habitat, for example, big game winter range, that, you know, would trigger a consult and would not necessarily necessitate absolute avoidance with proper planning. And so this kind of provides us an opportunity to talk on a side-by-side basis and plan for minimizing impacts, you know, under the rule that Mr. Duranlo pointed out. So there are certainly some cases where, you know, we don't know how to mitigate. We don't know how to create a new sage-grouse lek, for example. And so we would potentially recommend denial on some pointed permits. But there are some other places that fall within the HPH category that aren't NSO that we may have mitigative strategies that would be effective and can work through with operators.
Commissioner Messner, follow up?
No, thank you.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, that was a good segue with respect to another question I had that relates to the Gunnison versus sage grouse distances, you know, for no surface occupancy. And one of the questions I had was just what you just touched on there is I know there's some, there have been some attempts in other places and with other related species, well, not really related, I guess, but like with lesser prairie chickens, for example, to create man-made leks with kind of varying success. And has that been done in Colorado? And it sounds like, based on what you just said, that has not been done or it has not been successful. I was just curious about that in terms of an opportunity to regain habitat, because I do know there are a lot of species that can respond well to, you know, man-made habitat creation in certain cases, but it, you know, varies quite a bit amongst species. So I was curious about that, and also as it relates to the difference in the two species with the buffer distances.
Mr. Holtz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Nanjapa. I don't believe that we have actually, I might be corrected if someone's on that's staff of ours that wants to chime in and tell me that we have, please let me know, but I do not believe that we have successfully created a lek from scratch for either Gunnison's or greater sage grouse. So I guess in answer to that question, I don't think we can effectively mitigate those in Colorado.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Like I said, I wasn't aware that that had occurred, but it was interesting to see that, you know, there have been some other species that's been attempted for. So that said, do you, there's been some concerns raised, you know, about the distance for Gunnison sage grouse, which is a federally threatened species, versus greater sage grouse, which is not currently, in part because of all the great partnership efforts that have been happening. But, you know, can you just elaborate a little bit further on how that distance was chosen, or if there was a reason not to increase that distance?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question. And there was many of the parties over in that area that were sort of suggesting that the distances should be similar. So any additional information, Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's an excellent question. And this issue actually is really illustrative of the principle that I talked about earlier, that there is a range of management options within proper wildlife management. So at first that might seem counterintuitive, as Commissioner Nanjapa pointed out, that you would have a species with a higher degree of federal threatened listing at a lower buffer zone than another species. And so, you know, we tend to base our recommendations on as much data as we possibly can, just like most would. And we try not to extrapolate species by species where we don't have great justification. And so a little bit of history on this one is that 0.6 of a buffer was kind of originally the suggested buffer zone for both greater sage grouse and Gunnison sage grouse. And since the time that that buffer zone has gone into place, there's been significant study of greater sage grouse and significant literature that would suggest that 1 mile is a much more appropriate buffer for greater sage grouse. But there's been very little corresponding study specifically for Gunnison sage grouse. So we have, you know, significant justification to bump up that buffer zone for greater sage grouse, and no specific justification to bump it up for Gunnison sage grouse. That said, there's a very legitimate argument that those two species are very similar and that some extrapolation might be appropriate in this case. And so there is an argument for keeping it at 0.6, commensurate with what the county land use planning buffer zones are there. And there's also an argument for extrapolating the literature from greater sage grouse to Gunnison sage grouse and increasing it to 1 mile. From CPW's perspective, we don't differentiate between oil and gas buffer zones and other land use buffer zones. And so whatever the preferred buffer zone is that we would determine in the end would be our recommendation across all types of land use. Hopefully that comes close to addressing that question, Commissioner.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Ackerman. I think that helps quite a bit. Thank you.
Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm sure we're going to hear additional testimony on the Gunnison sage grouse. But based on my background as a previous Gunnison County Commissioner, you know, I can share that that there may need to be some consideration about making those distances equidistant from the greater sage grouse to the Gunnison sage grouse. I think the Gunnison land use code determining the 0.6 miles setback from Lex is certainly county specific. It was more specific around development of housing subdivisions, those types of impacts. There's not Gunnison sage grouse in Gunnison County where there is oil and gas development currently. And the satellite populations in other counties besides Gunnison County are really where some of the conflicts are going to inevitably occur between potential oil and gas development and the Gunnison sage grouse. And so I'll be curious to hear additional testimony on that from both Gunnison County as well as San Miguel County to get more in depth on that. But I do think there's some questions around that right now.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make sure that folks have had their opportunity. Is there any more questioning along this line? Because I'd like to go back to the direct habitat mitigation issue.
I think you're free to do so.
Okay. So I can't remember if it was Mr. Holst or Mr. Ackerman when we were going through the rules, we were talking about the direct impact habitat mitigation fee and why it was being applied equally across the state. So for example, probably property is more expensive in some areas than in others, and the mitigation fee seemed, to me, it seemed from a citizen's perspective, it seemed low. And one of you pointed out to me, and I thought it was a good point, that there were some equity issues around if we were to try to figure out like a scaling per acre mitigation fee instead of setting this flat fee. And I was wondering if you could recap that conversation again, or your point around that, because I thought it was a good one. And then to also point out to folks, the other point that I think I missed the first time through the rules was, it's not just this direct impact mitigation fee. There will be a discussion about the indirect impacts, and that will be an additional fee that would be implemented on the operator. And so while this might seem low, I try not to put a, that there's this part B that will happen that will also determine kind of this mitigation fee that might be implemented.
Mr. Holtz.
Sure, I can attempt to address that. I'm going to start with your second question, Commissioner McGowan. So that, just to be clear, so that the direct impact fee and indirect impact fee applies to those 1202D habitats specifically, and the indirect impact fee would potentially apply, as Mr. Dronlow outlined, within sort of a specific well pad density that we would see, where a proposed new location was being permitted. So that sort of 1 to 5, and then once we got beyond 5 locations per section, we wouldn't be so concerned about indirect impacts anymore. So that's just to clarify, that's when that would occur. And you are correct, that would be in addition to the direct impact fee. And so in terms of how we calculated that direct impact fee, you're absolutely right. We did look at the cost of, for the long-term habitat loss, the cost of conserving habitat statewide, and as you can imagine, it is quite variable for some of the parts. Some parts of the state, orders of magnitude, frankly, different. And so we're cognizant of that, and so we were trying to essentially, dollar cost average across the entire state, so that we came up with one fee. And it's, going to be a lot in some areas, and it's going to be, not seem like a lot in other areas. And so that is a disadvantage of doing it that way. The advantage, of course, is that it provides some simplicity. And, we also saw, I guess, while we're on this topic, some concern about, why didn't we include pads that are over 11 acres, and what would the fee be for those pads for direct impacts? Frankly, when we looked at it, there actually were not a lot of pads. We looked at kind of the distribution of the disturbance with well pads, and try to sort of pick the center point, if you will. There were not a lot of well pads over 11 acres, but when we do have those, we think we could use essentially the same methodology that we use to calculate that flat fee on a per acre basis, because we looked at a per acre kind of a fee, although we averaged the acres. For 11 acres, we would just do it on a site-specific basis and use that same kind of calculation. Does that make sense?
Mr. Ackerman, would you like to further?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Commissioner McGowan, I just wanted to address the other aspect that you pointed out, which is with regard to equity. And we did have some discussion about that as well. And as you can imagine, certainly there are properties that are more expensive in some counties of our state than others. And if we went with more specific geographical location property calculations, it certainly puts forth the appearance that it's much more expensive, or one might say more protective, of counties that are of higher socioeconomic status, and maybe less protective of counties that are, and I'm saying protective in the sense of if you wouldn't want more development there, of lower socioeconomic status. So we did consider the equity issue as well in averaging that out.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you. That's what I was getting at, that discussion that we had. I guess my second question is whether or not the habitat mitigation fee is also supposed to work to encourage an operator to look at an alternate site, because I'm not sure, and again, this is me putting my own kind of personal thoughts about this, and I might be wrong, so I'd be interested in hearing testimony from the operators. I'm not sure that $13,000 an acre is a deterrent where I might decide to put my site somewhere else, not within a high priority habitat. And so Are we looking at the mitigation fee just simply as what it would take for us to find a commensurate space somewhere else, or are we also using it as a deterrent, so to speak, to encourage an operator to look at a different site?
Sure.
Director Murphy, I'm sorry, I was looking at everyone else.
I know I've been pretty
Referring
quiet,
you.
right? People are tired of hearing from me at this point, but Commissioner McGowan, I think it's a good question. We have structured the rules, I think, separately to encourage siting outside of high priority habitat by requiring an ALA and a consultation on the front end to understand why people are planning to be within a high priority habitat. We've also put certain habitats in 1202C to ensure that there isn't development in those except in really unusual circumstances approved through a variance. And so when we get down into the actual mitigation, we are looking to offset the actual mitigation or the actual impacts through mitigation, whether it's a plan or a fee, but not with the idea that the fee should be a deterrent, and keeping in mind that there are options there, right? Like you can come up with a compensatory mitigation plan or pay a fee. So it's not a mandatory fee either.
Commissioner McGowan, follow up. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple questions along that same topic. So as we're looking at surface disturbance and we're making a determination of impact, can someone talk a little bit about the different elements that are included in that analysis? And to be more specific, I mean, are we including access roads? Are we including gathering lines? Are we, what are the specific things that we're including as far as the surface impact in that calculation?
Mr. Holtz.
So when we came up with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when we came up with that fee, Commissioner Messner, we looked at the average disturbance that was basically submitted on a Form 2A, and typically that includes the well pad and access road. Those are the two primary components of that. And so going forward, I guess, COGCC now I think is looking at some other facilities as well, but that's how we calculated that fee.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Mr. Duranlo, understanding the access road, the pad, any new kind of gathering lines or surface disturbances around gathering lines that would be analyzed within the Form 2A. And then if we're analyzing the access road, how much of the access road are we analyzing? Are we analyzing it from another well pad, or are we analyzing any new road? Is that kind of what we're analyzing?
Mr. Duranlo.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the question. Yeah, so new road construction is considered when we consider a new oil and gas location. I would say there's probably been some inconsistency over the years on how operators report that disturbance. Obviously, if an oil and gas location is located adjacent to a county road, you're not going to get much addition by counting, 20 to 50 feet of access road. In areas such as the Piceance Basin, where a new portion of an access road could be a quarter mile or 3 miles long, that can be significant. The access roads are considered because they are a permanent, intrusion on the landscape. So as long as the oil and gas location is in operation, the access road is there and remains a disturbance, has traffic, and that. So whereas the pipeline consideration, since those are subject to reclamation, that's not quite considered the same way in terms of that disturbance regime for calculating the net acreage of disturbance for an oil and gas location. And additionally, I think those the pipelines often follow the access road, although not always, because they can cut across the landscape a little bit more freely. But that said, we think that our rules, that we've addressed in the 300 series and here in the 900 series, I think we have have strengthened our ability to look at and review those off-location flow line corridors.
Commissioner Messner, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for those. That's good information. I just wanted to make sure I understood the different elements of that analysis. And I wonder if you could just talk someone could talk a little bit more about, when we talk about compensatory projects, what do those look like? And I know they're going to be different around the state for different species or such, but I think it would be good to kind of have an understanding of, what are the different projects that an operator could do as an option, or as we collect these compensatory mitigation fees, what types of projects they may be utilized for.
Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Messner. It's a great question, and I'll start with just kind of a little bit of some overall comments, and then ask Mr. Holtz to give us maybe a specific example of what we've done in the past. But our intent is to certainly focus on the species and location for which the compensatory mitigation is paid. And so as much as possible, we would like to do the compensatory mitigation in the same herd, in the same habitat, in the same rough geographical location as the impacted area, in order to try to maintain the integrity of that herd and that species and the program itself. That's our overall philosophy, and John Holtz can add a little bit more about what a project might look like.
Mr. Holtz?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Messner. So, currently, just to give you some examples that we do internally, and this is what it would look like if we were to basically take the fee and do a project, and we would expect similar from operators. We have 4 habitat coordinators statewide that are constantly doing, habitat work on a variety of landscapes for a variety of species. And so a project that could happen, for example, is sort of a mastication project, a brush clearing or thinning project to improve big game habitat. We also, for a good one for greater Gunnison sagegrass would be clearing out pinyon juniper encroachment in sage habitats to maintain that large sagebrush landscape, projects like that. We've also had operators, frankly, do conservation easements to actually conserve habitat that's good quality habitat already in perpetuity. And so we've worked with operators under the existing rules to actually do these kinds of projects now. And I think that's how it would, exist as well in the future. It'd just be a little more transparent, I think, under the new rules.
Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that. And that was actually one of my questions too, is this funding, is it allowed to be utilized as matching funds towards bigger, conservation easement type opportunities?
Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you. Certainly that's something, yes. And directly to answer your question, yes, it's certainly something that could be taken into consideration. If for example, it was mule deer mitigation on the western slope, and the request was to use that money for matching projects on lesser prairie chicken on the eastern plains, we'd have issues with that, as I'm sure the operator and probably you would as well. But within the scope of the philosophy that I outlined earlier, certainly it could be used to partner with other funds.
Commissioner Messner?
No, thank you.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Holt and Mr. Holtz and Mr. Ackerman for the information there. I had a related question on the compensatory mitigation, and I too sort of feel that number feels a bit low, but understand kind of what you're discussing in terms of how you're evaluating this. But one thing I'm wondering about is, not necessarily in the high priority habitat, but in other areas where there's an understanding of, other priority species or sensitive habitats that could potentially be disturbed, and compensatory mitigation might be an option. Is that something that can occur with consultation? And then I also am curious about whether the fee would be appropriate for, whether you feel it's sufficient for projects that might include like putting in a road crossing structure, for fish passage or for, other aquatic species passage or those types of things. So, so again, just kind of wondering about if compensatory mitigation is possible outside of high priority habitat, and also whether you feel those, maybe I should ask first if that fee would apply or if it would be just specific to the area.
Mr. Holtz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Ninjapa. I think compensatory mitigation could be possible outside of high priority habitat if we were to identify a particular resource that we needed to kind of use that on-ramp, and then an operator really wanted to impact that resource. We could work with COGCC staff on a case-by-case basis to look for a compensatory mitigation option to allow the operator to move forward. I think we would probably use the same sort of fee scenario that we have set up for high priority habitat. In terms of your question about things like crossing structures and whatnot, I mean, given that we couldn't afford to purchase a crossing structure with that direct impact fee for one pad, we would contemplate pooling the monies that are paid into that direct habitat or that direct impact mitigation fund to do things like that. So we could certainly do projects like that. It just might require that the funds are pooled for some of those larger projects.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Holtz. I appreciate that. And I know that we are, in the draft rules, we have the no surface occupancy for all the 1202C species. But if there was an option for compensatory mitigation, would there be any options for some of those aquatic habitats in order to compensate for the impacts that we're trying to avoid in certain instances? So for example, if there was a request for a variance or something to that effect, I'm just trying to figure out, what the options could potentially be in order to, obviously try to avoid, but also minimize or mitigate if we have those options available.
Mr. Holtz?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Ninjapa. I think with those particular 1202C habitats, I think that is a possibility. It would depend on our site-specific consultation related to those habitats. I guess those are sort of unique in those 1202C habitats because there may be something that we could do to mitigate some of the effects there. We'd have to work closely with our counterparts at COGCC if that was going to be the case, but it would be, it would require a variance, and so we'd have to move forward with that as kind of a package.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Holst. And last but not least, just along the lines of what Commissioner Messner asked, those compensatory mitigation fees that would be paid in could be, am I correct in understanding that those could be used to match a state wildlife grant as well for some of those priority species if they were impacted in the area?
Mr. Ackerman?
Yes, they sure could. Thanks, Commissioner Nanjapa. And just if you don't mind, if I can just clarify a little bit on your previous question as well, that currently the rules are set up so that those zones would be no surface occupancy zones, and that the variances would be intended to be after consultation between your staff and us, that habitat would largely be unimpacted, therefore supporting a variance to go forward, and potentially not a lot of compensatory mitigation opportunity as we envision variances under the riparian setbacks. But the rules do give enough give so that if that was something that the commission wanted to consider as part of a variance, that would be within their purview.
Commissioner Messner, then Commissioner Gonzalez.
Commissioner Gonzalez, if you got a question, go ahead. I'll ask after.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Ooh, be careful what you ask for, Commissioner Mester. I got a handful, but I'll start with one just because we ventured into the variance discussion. I know we're going to hear a lot about that this afternoon, and so just in terms of kind of signposting where my questions are going to go, it's going to be about variance versus a pre-consultation and why 1202C was kind of different than 1202A and 1202B in that regard. So I guess my first question is, what are the benefits of having a pre-consultation under 1202A and 1202B, and why don't those benefits apply to the evaluation of 1202C?
Mr. Geronimo.
Yeah, and I'll certainly ask, for John or Brett to chime in, but, as I stated in my presentation, those 1202C habitats are the most sensitive, and they are where we have determined that avoidance is the appropriate protective measure, right? So as opposed to, having a plan to operate within those areas, we really do want to strive for avoidance. And it's not the density of pads in those areas that impacts, it's the development in those areas that impacts. And so that's why we've approached those in that manner.
Mr. Holtz.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Gonzalez. Yeah, totally agree with Mr. Geronimo's statement there. I mean, it really is, those are our, avoidance habitats. But I do think there's a little bit of a misconception because just because it is, the 1202C stuff still falls within that overall consult habitat. So we would actually get a consultation and potentially a pre-application, communication from an operator to look at what their options are around that 1202C habitat. So we would still look at the ALA process. And frankly, if there's anything that we could do, or, if the species and habitat is no longer present and unlikely to return to that area. So I think we still would go through that sort of initial part of that consultation to figure out what the situation is right there on the ground.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Mr. Geronimo, Mr. Holtz. And I appreciate the sensitivity of these species. And I think what I'm getting at is that there's a couple things that have kind of jumped out to me in regards to the maps and to the application of a hard mapped buffer that operations have to adhere to, right? We talked about kind of the limitations of that mapping when it came to waterways that may move over time. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that on the ground features such as topography may limit the effectiveness of those buffers for specific species on specific sites. The consultation is already, being engaged in, and as was just kind of acknowledged, there's the possibility or opportunity that the habitat doesn't exist, the species doesn't exist in those areas, in which case a variance would still have to be applied for. And in my understanding of the variance process versus the pre-consultation process, under a pre-consultation, the operator would, or the applicant would go in, they would have a pre-application consultation with CPW. If CPW agrees with them, or, there would be some sort of collaborative process. It may not be an agreement or a denial flat off the bat. There may be, some workings there that create a better, more beneficial solution. And then it goes before the commission for ultimate approval. With of course, an understanding of what CPW is providing, and hopefully, some sort of deference, at the very least, to the expertise of the CPW. And then if you go through the variance process, it just kind of flips the time frame of that. Whereas they would apply for a variance, it creates perhaps a more adversarial environment for that variance. And then that would also trigger a CPW consultation, an opportunity for CPW to waive, and ultimately a commission approval of it. So it all ends in the same result. And I'm just trying to understand, I guess I'm failing to see the downside of a pre-consultation elimination from 1202C, or an inclusion, should I say, the downside of an inclusion with 1202C that doesn't end in the same result as if there was a pre-consultation. That was an inartful question, but I hope you get what I'm trying to ask. What's I understand the sensitivities, but what's the difference in the end result here that we're missing?
Director Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. And Commissioner Gonzalez, I think it's a robust question, and part of it is about how do the rules work? How do we provide certainty and clarity about what our expectations are, at least? But I think the fundamental question is really, should we have pre-consultation on 1202C explicitly? I think that we can live with that. And I think it can make sense for the reasons you've articulated. What we're most concerned about in the 1202C space is creating an exception process as compared to requiring a variance to cite within 1202C. So to me, there are maybe a couple of layers in your question. Those were the two that I wanted to pull out and talk about, and then obviously see if I actually answered your question.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Yeah, you answered some of my question, and again, I get where it's coming from. I think when I'm thinking about this, I don't see it as an exception. I see it as an opportunity for the regulating agencies to engage better with the regulated community and to find the best options here. And that flexibility, I think, is important. If there's opportunities for better information through ground truthing or through better information by not applying a buffer that is effectively not needed because of on the ground features, I think it's just, at least in those two, what I envision being, maybe not an extreme minority of cases, would be an appropriate amount of flexibility under this rule. So you answered my question. I've kind of shared my views on it. That's kind of where I sit there. I'm welcoming more commentary from staff and from CPW.
Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez, and certainly see where you're coming from there. I think your philosophy that you're talking about there is right along the line of why the draft rules contain a potential waiver pre-variance for intermittent and ephemeral streams, which is where we would expect this to come up more often than in any other place. Just going back to the other comments made by Mr. Holtz and others, that there are a few habitats throughout the state, as you saw on Mr. Holtz's map, that really the intent is to protect those habitats and have actual NSOs on those habitats, and any variant or any variance from that process would likely be the exception rather than the rule. And so we wouldn't want to create the same type of administrative waiver process that wasn't controlled by this commission as they are enforcing their rule of NSO on those habitats. I argued myself in a little bit of a circle there, but I hope you get what I was saying.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ackerman. I do get what you're saying. I guess I'm hard pressed to see how the commission isn't, again, in that same position, right? I don't see us relegating any authority under that. I don't see it as an administrative burden, I guess, on the front end, because the consultation already happens and the waiver would have to happen under a variance. And if it's appropriate, it's going to be recommended. If it's not appropriate, it's not. So I appreciate the additional color, Mr. Ackerman. I don't know that it gets me off the ledge that I'm on right now, but thanks.
Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Somewhat along these lines, I was curious if we know approximately how many or what proportion of the streams that are designated under QRNS are intermittent or ephemeral. Actually, I should just say RNS, since that's where we have our waiver provision. Do we know that offhand?
Mr. Ackerman.
I'm currently checking with our experts to see if we do know that offhand, Commissioner. I don't, but can get back to you if I get that. It looks like right now I'm hearing at least over 50%, but we don't have better off the top of our heads.
Mr. Holtz, did you want to weigh in?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Ninjapa, yeah, we do have that information for, I'm looking at it here. For the native species, the intermittent portion is about 45% of those streams for the native species conservation waters. For the sport fish management waters, it's about a little under 29% of those are intermittent or ephemeral. The ephemeral portion is actually quite small. It's mostly intermittent for both of those.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ackerman and Mr. Holst. I think that's helpful in kind of understanding, you know, the overall impact of the rules, but also the protective nature. And I do, you know, I do appreciate that we have, you know, certain species that really do rely on that intermittent nature of certain streams. With that, I guess with the waiver, I just wanted to also confirm, and I know we kind of discussed this in our prior staff meetings, but just again for the record, with those waiver provisions, can you just elaborate on, you know, whether there are additional conditions of approval or, you know, other stipulations that are part of that waiver process, or is it just a you know, a conversation and then no, it's okay, you can go ahead there.
Mr. Holtz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Ninjapa. I think it would be a discussion. I mean, I don't think we're envisioning many of these being like a blanket waiver. I think, you know, if we work with the operator and it's pretty clear that they can encroach upon one of those intermittent and ephemeral drainages, maybe it's they get within 100 feet or maybe they get within 150 feet and they do some additional things to protect that particular habitat feature. I think that's really what we're talking about, is just to provide that kind of flexibility in those situations, sort of site specifically.
Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of different questions here, my final questions. I will just make a comment to start with, and I do think in 1202C, at least the way that I read it, it clearly indicates that there is a no surface occupancy, and that avoidance is the tool there. I do think that the variance seems to be an appropriate tool for consultation with CPW and determining if there needs to be specific things that need to be considered in a ground truthing type of situation or a topographical situation. So I'll just make that statement. I'm certainly interested in hearing both sides as we hear additional deliberations on that. But one question I had kind of off topic here, kind of going back to the compensatory mitigation piece, is I know that there's SCORP and there's different range management plans for different species. But I think there will be questions from some of the parties moving forward here around what the decision-making process looks like as far as deciding on projects, deciding on utilization of funding, how that ties into a bigger master plan. I wonder if someone could talk about that, whether we're kind of moving in one direction with this funding mechanism, or it's a little more scattershot, or kind of how that will be decided.
Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you, Commissioner. That's a great question, an appropriate question. And, you know, transparency is important to your agency and to ours. And in the end, it's important to note that all these funds will be transparently visible to anyone that wants to see them. And these are details that I think we still need to work out. If the commission does go in that direction of approving compensatory mitigation, there are further details that we need to work out, which could certainly include participation by this commission as you see fit in that decision-making process. We generally plan on a statewide basis on a species level for most of the species for which these compensatory mitigation funds would be paid in. And I would expect that we would wrap that into our larger planning effort for those species, and to the extent possible, limit the funds that come in from this program to the geographic area from which they were received. That's my rough sketch of how I'd expect this to go forward, but we're certainly open to further discussion and commentary about the level of participation that COGCC would like to have.
Chair, may I follow?
Yes, Director Murphy.
Thank you. I think the other piece that makes some of these bigger picture questions that you're asking, Commissioner Mesner, a little bit difficult to answer is that the fee is structured as an alternative. And so it's not clear to me today whether we're going to get $13,000 over the course of the year or $13 million. I think one of those is very unlikely. Maybe both of those are really unlikely numbers, right? But I would like to test drive this a little bit and include it in kind of the reporting back mechanism through 904 about what did we actually take in fees, so that we can think about whether we need to build out a more robust structure that provides automatic reporting out or not. But until I know that we've got some certain volume of dollars coming in annually, it feels a little premature to build out a really, really clear, really robust automatic reporting system, and recognizing we will have transparency through the permitting process and also through the 904 reporting back to you, commissioners.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we talk a little bit about the 500-foot buffer for aquatic species? And this is not meant to be a trick question, but are all streams created equal, right? So again, I'm going to use this overused term that I keep bringing up of us coming up with kind of some blunt tools and blunt instruments. And for intermittent and ephemeral streams, I guess in my mind, my assumption is that those are smaller, perhaps seasonal, and whether or not the 500-foot in all instances is going to be appropriate. I know that I talked with CPW staff about actually mapping stream segments. I know that CPW'S maps various stream segments for water quality purposes, so that someone who might be doing something by a stream, we have some pretty accurate data per segment about how that segment is meeting criteria or not, and how extra measures have to be taken to meet those criteria. And so just some thoughts from staff about, and I think the response was, we don't have everything down to the specific segment, and that would take some time to do. And so just some thoughts from staff about those comments. And I know we're going to hear a lot probably of testimony about buffers.
Yes, Commissioner, I think you will. This is Julie Murphy, the director. I think that, as we look at the data that we do have about streams, right, we're looking at the National Hydrography Database. And from that, looking at how do we provide protections in concert with the data that CPW has mapped for these very specific habitats. I think we have a good start on that data, and we have the expertise of CPW informing us that those habitats are critical and important to the work of protecting wildlife resources. And I say wildlife resources to be encompassing of more than just the critters themselves. That being said, we also know that topography can be a challenge, and there may be some situations where for some of these intermittent or ephemeral streams, it may be more appropriate to look closer than 300 feet or 500 feet. And that's why we wanted to build in the flexibility into the rule itself to be able to make those site-specific considerations. I think, as we talked about in both the 600 series and today, a 300-foot buffer, a 500-foot buffer, a buffer of any specific number is necessarily a bright line rule and necessarily over and under inclusive, right? But I think it provides certainty, it provides clarity to start the conversation. And without that, it's hard for me to say, without doing kind of a really deep dive that's basin wide for all of the different oil and gas basins of all the streams, to delineate those segments, that's a huge undertaking. And how do we, if that's the goal, I think we can get there, but how do we deal with the interim? And to me, the clarity and certainty that's provided with the data that we have and the information that we know today, along with a bit of flexibility, helps us integrate wildlife planning, especially, and I really want to emphasize the planning component of it, into an operator's thinking as it's preparing for a new oil and gas development. That was a bit of a wandering answer. And so if Mr. Ackerman wants to chime in and provide some of the more specific science, I'd be happy to have that help.
Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Director Murphy. Commissioner McGowan, that's a great question. And directly to answer your question is, yeah, absolutely not. All streams aren't created equal. You're exactly right in asking that question. I would point out that in Colorado, you know, a relatively arid state, we estimate that 90% of the wildlife species in this state use riparian areas at one point or another in their life cycle. So we believe it's imperatively important to protect the relatively limited riparian zones that we have here in the state. And you're exactly right that a 300 or a 500-foot buffer might be overstepping in some of these smaller streams, hence the variant or hence the waiver. But they also might be understepping significantly on some of our larger systems. And so philosophically, what we've done here in these draft regulations is put forth a, as Director Murphy said, a bright line, which is, you know, largely applicable when you look at it on the gross scale as far as protecting riparian habitats in the state as a whole. It provides predictability and it provides understandability on the part of operators and a gross protection of riparian habitat. A different philosophical approach would certainly to be more specific and more precise, which would protect each riparian zone more precisely as we devised a system to do so. It would be harder to predict for operators, harder to administer, and harder to understand. And so you have trade-offs with either philosophy, and in the draft rules, we opted to go with the brighter line. But I would just go on record as stating that it's tough to pick a number that fits all, because that just doesn't exist. Once again, you're working within the range of what the literature offers.
Mr. Ackerman, can I piggyback a question on that answer? Reading through the most recent responses that we received from all of our stakeholders, there was a great deal of consensus from operators and the Western and Rural Local Government Coalition and others that the data that you were relying upon did not, in fact, justify a 500-foot setback. Do you guys have a response to that? Because it was seen in a number of the different responses.
Yeah, I certainly can, and I know that Director Murphy maybe has something to add here as well. And so if it's okay with you, Mr. Chair, I'll start and ask if Director Murphy would follow up as well. And again, it is tough to pick a statewide number. You can make an argument in any given case that a statewide number is going to be, you know, inapplicable in a lot of cases. And so once again, for predictability and gross protection as a whole, a statewide number approach is a valid approach. There is significant data that we could vigorously defend a 300-foot buffer zone to protect aquatic species on riparian zones in the literature. The literature goes all the way out to, you know, a quarter mile or even a half mile in some cases as a more protective and better zone in certain situations. As you go up in distance, the applicability of those distances really becomes more situational and site-specific as to when they might be appropriate. And so certainly 500 feet does fit within the range of literature that's been offered out there. It doesn't represent in our minds a bare minimum, which would be 300 feet, but isn't an overstep if you're setting a statewide number.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. Director Murphy, did you want to add to that?
It's really hard to add to something so eloquent, so I'd rest on what Mr. Ackerman said.
Let me, Mr. Ackerman, if I could ask another question, kind of coming at the whole issue from a completely different perspective. I tried to read everything, but some of the environmental, and this has nothing to do with the 500, 300, but it has to do with another protective wildlife things. So some of the environmental groups or that, you know, argue that, you know, we're using high priority habitat for protections, but they say that you acknowledge, you CPW, that you've got data gaps that prevent you from designating HPH, for example, elk, mule deer, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, because the agency does not know the location of some of these species when it ranges. I guess question number one is, do you agree that there's these data gaps? And then secondly, is what's being promulgated, you know, sufficiently protective of all wildlife? I guess that's sort of the argument they're making, is we're protecting some subsets of wildlife, but not all.
That's a really great question, Mr. Chair. And I'll I'll answer that in a couple of ways. And I would say that as with all industry and all scientific data, data is constantly evolving. So it never is complete. I wouldn't necessarily characterize that as often that there are complete data gaps, but data is always improving, and we certainly try to rely on the best available data, which to the point made earlier is why we think it's important to continue to update those maps as the data becomes more available. The second part of that, I would say that I would allude back to my earlier point during my presentation that every square inch of Colorado at some point is habitat for some species. And so this falls within the range of wildlife management, right? Social goals and the things that we want to see in our state. And our state has pretty clearly said that we want to protect wildlife habitat. We want wildlife species to continue in perpetuity, but people have to live here as well. And so you could make an argument for essentially any part of Colorado as part of wildlife habitat that's important to the life cycle of that species. What we've tried to do in these regulations is find a balance where we're protecting and really protecting the most important and most vulnerable habitats that wildlife depend on in the state, that if injured or if damaged could really cause concerns for those species. And then doing our best to recommend allowance in areas that maybe can be mitigated, or maybe are less important and a species can continue to persist with other land use type developments in those areas. So this is the million-dollar question, and it's a very difficult one that I think we've struggled with over time and throughout the land use development of Colorado, and becomes a more important and poignant question as we move forward as to what are we going to protect, and what allowance are we going to have for continued development of humans in the state? It's a tough question.
Thank you for that answer. Other commissioners with questions? Commissioner Hackett, and then Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question about CPW consultations. So the CDPHE consultation rule allows local governments the ability to request a CDPHE consultation, but the CPW rule does not. And I'm just curious if you can help me understand the thinking behind that. Is it because the specific consultation triggers in the CPW rule are so comprehensive and the high priority habitat acreage has increased substantially? Or is it because the local government concerns should be addressed through the pre-consultation process that a local government wouldn't need to request a consultation in most cases?
Chair.
Sorry, Director Murphy.
Thanks. Commissioner Hackett, I think it's a good question. And as I think about our relationship with local governments in particular, we often rely on local governments to come forward on behalf of their human being citizens. And when we think about our public health mission, our partnership with CDPHE is critically important in that realm. And so I think we've structured that slightly differently as compared to the wildlife, which to me are more of a statewide management directive. Ergo, we try to partner more directly with CPW on it. If anybody on our team has anything to add to that, I'd welcome it. But that to me is kind of the functional difference.
Mr. Drala.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and Julie or Director Murphy, you're spot on. But I would say a couple other points, and one is that land use jurisdiction. Local governments have the land use jurisdiction. We are dovetailing into that, and with our protective measures, working with Parks and Wildlife to achieve protection for wildlife. Local governments do have, under SB 19181, the ability to craft their own oil and gas regulations, and certainly in that effort, they can seek to rely on Parks and Wildlife's experts and expertise in their own processes as well. And then, the last point I would make is that early and pre-consultation, the alternative location analysis process, we really are striving to bring them into, bring the operator into the process with as much information as they can have early on in the process. So not sure if I've muddied the waters or cleared it, but I feel like we we have tried to sort of layer that whole concept in there.
AAG Minor.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair, which is that Rule 302G2 does explicitly authorize local governments to raise wildlife concerns in the course of the consultation with the local government. So it's not built into the CPW consultation piece, but certainly as part of the local government consultation covered by Rule 302G, wildlife resources are one of the topics that can be addressed.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I don't have any additional questions on that at this point.
Thank you, Commissioner Hackett. Commissioner Najapa, I believe you were next.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to address a comment that came up in the public comments the other day, and that was related to water sampling within areas that might be near, where a site might go in, a riparian area. And I think the person that made the comment was suggesting that there weren't sampling requirements, if there is a site that's built near or around a riparian area. So in this instance, if it would be maybe beyond the 500 feet or with a variance or et cetera. So I was just curious if the staff could elaborate on that, and maybe along with that, I didn't get to fully digest that slide that you had put up, Director Murphy, about the interaction with the water rules, and maybe it would be useful to just put that up and talk about 411 and some of the other pieces of our rules that help address some of these things.
Mr. Duranlo.
Yeah, well, Director Murphy is looking for that slide. I would say that we did not, the aquatics habitat starts as an NSO. Anytime that an operator then is proposing to be in those and seeking the director's exception to be in those areas for the ephemeral and intermittent streams, we certainly can, on a case-by-case basis, address water sampling with a condition of approval if we determine that it is appropriate. I would say that water sampling, surface water sampling, probably has less value in an ephemeral setting, where you really have to time being out there and getting a sample. Intermittent, it may have a little bit more value. I think what we've seen from the sampling that we've done over the last dozen years with the 317B surface water supply area protection rules, we've definitely seen that where that has the most value is along perennial waterways. So, it's not to say that we can't require, a water sample be collected when when there is sufficient water present, but it seems more appropriate to consider that on a case-by-case basis.
We've got the slide up now. Any further questions on that? Okay, any further questions? Commissioner Najapa.
Sorry, thank you. One last question that I had was related to in 1202A with respect to the birds nesting and the hazing that's noted in there. I was just kind of curious, what does that entail? Could you elaborate a little bit further on that?
I'll start, Chairman, if I may, and then I would certainly ask for support on this one from CPW. But the intent there is that the birds would start nesting in an area April 1st through August 31st, and if an operator comes in after birds have nested in an area and clears and grubs, strips the topsoil off the land, they're going to take those nests and birds out of that area. So the idea is, if, let's say, they have a project that's starting in June, kicking off in June, that what they want to do is go out and make sure that birds don't establish nests in that area, so that when they come in June, they don't, they don't have that take. So that would be where they would either, haze birds off to ensure that they don't establish nests in that area, or, and so they establish nests outside next door in the field next door, or, come in and survey for nests before they do. That would be, maybe a little bit more risky, because the birds could have established nests, and then they would be required to protect that nest once it's identified. And certainly CPW can chime in if you want.
I think you did a good job there, Mr. Geronimo. They're not unmuting, so very good. Further questions, Commissioner Nanjapa? Further questions from other commissioners? Okay, excellent presentation, great dialogue, great questions and answers. I think we are at our lunch break. It is 12:47. We generally take an hour off to let people take care of other business and otherwise. So let's return at 1:45. Thank you.